Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we drift into a decade that still puzzles the historians who study it, because no one can quite agree on whether it was a genuine revolution or the largest game of pretend ever played with real money. We are talking about the dot-com era, that strange, glittering window in the 1990s when young men and women with no business degree, no profit, and often no working product became wealthier than shipping magnates and oil barons of centuries past, simply by promising that a web page would someday somehow make money. Before we sink into tonight's story, take a slow breath, settle into your pillow. If you find comfort in supporting the channel, a like or a subscribe helps more than you know, but only ever if you're genuinely enjoying these evenings with me. A quiet thank you tonight to the viewer who requested this particular slice of history. Your suggestions shape almost everything we cover here, and I am grateful for each one. For those who prefer to listen on the go, we're also streaming on Spotify, linked below. And for members who want even more to drift off to, there's a separate extended cut waiting in the members area. Now, dim your lights. Let the room go soft and quiet. Tonight, we are going to live inside the skin of a person who does not exist, and yet existed everywhere at once during this decade. The young, unprepared, wildly overconfident internet millionaire. We will follow a single, ordinary, extraordinary day in this person's life, from the moment they wake in a house too large for their own comfort, to the moment the money that made all of it possible reveals itself to be built from something far less solid than steel or gold. Let yourself wonder, as we begin, what it must have felt like to hold a fortune that could vanish before your coffee got cold. Chapter 1. The house that debt bought you. Open your eyes in a bedroom that does not feel entirely like your own, even though the deed, somewhere in a drawer downstairs, insists that it is. The ceiling above you is high enough to hold its own weather, or so it seems in the gray haze of early morning. You bought this house 8 weeks ago. You toured it exactly once for 11 minutes before telling the realtor it would do. A house this size does not get inspected twice by a man who has meetings to attend, and more importantly, an image to maintain. The mattress beneath you was shipped from overseas, filled with something your interior designer called a specialty fiber blend, a phrase you nodded at as though you understood it, and paid for as though you did not care. The sheets are cool and impossibly smooth, the kind of fabric that makes you briefly suspicious of your own good fortune. Somewhere below, you can hear the house beginning its private morning routine without you. A hum from the wine cellar's climate control, a soft click from a coffee machine you did not touch, warming itself on a timer nobody remembers setting. Getting out of this bed is, in its own small way, an expedition. It is wide enough that reaching the edge requires an act of will, a slow migration across a landscape of decorative pillows that exist purely to be removed each night and never once slept upon. Your feet, when they finally find the floor, meet warmth-heated tile, because somewhere along the way you decided that a man of your new standing should never again feel a cold surface beneath his soles. It is comfort so complete it becomes faintly suspicious, the way anything too easy eventually does. The bathroom, when you reach it, is larger than the apartment you rented 3 years ago, back when a magazine cover was still an idea belonging to someone else's life. The mirror here is enormous, unkind, and lit with a precision that reveals every hour of sleep you did not get last night. There is a shower with more dials than a small aircraft, and this morning, as most mornings, you will lose the opening round against it, cold water from an unexpected angle, then a spray that seems to come from the ceiling itself, before you finally, by accident more than memory, land on the setting you actually wanted. This is the peculiar comedy hiding inside sudden wealth. You possess nearly everything and operate almost none of it. A cellar of wine you're privately too nervous to open, in case you choose poorly in front of someone who would know the difference. A staff whose names you are still learning, in a house too large to require memorizing all of them at once. 2 years ago, you split the cost of heating with 3 roommates and celebrated when the check cleared. Today you stand dripping in a marble room built for someone far more sophisticated than you currently feel, wondering, quietly, Whether comfort and happiness were ever actually the same thing to begin with, you wrap yourself in a robe heavy enough to be mistaken for a winter coat. Downstairs, a phone has been ringing for some time now. The house line, most likely a banker eager to offer you money you have not yet found a use for. You let it ring. This, you have discovered, is one of the small quiet privileges that money buys. The right, however briefly, to let the world simply wait outside a closed door. But there is one room in this house that will tell you more about who you have become than any mirror could, and it happens to sit just past the kitchen, behind a set of doors heavy enough to belong on a bank vault. It is time to go and look at your cars. Chapter 2. The garage as confession. There is an instinct buried somewhere just beneath the ribs of anyone who becomes rich overnight, and it does not whisper, it shouts, and what it shouts is buy cars. Not a car. Cars, plural, arrange the way a museum arranges its prized wing, except every exhibit here runs on gasoline and terrible impulse control. The garage floor has been polished until it throws your own reflection back at you, slightly warped, slightly bewildered. Soft lighting falls across each vehicle, the way a spotlight falls across a painting nobody in the house has actually studied closely. There is a car you drive. There is a second, nearly identical car you drive only when the first is being detailed, which happens often enough that you have genuinely lost track of which one currently smells of new leather. There is a vintage model imported at extraordinary cost, whose ignition sequence involves steps you have never fully committed to memory, so it sits untouched, gleaming, silently judging you every time you walk past. You do not know how to check your own oil. You have never once changed a tire. You privately suspect, though you would never say it aloud, that one of these machines may in fact be cursed, purely because it has broken down 3 times despite costing more than most people's homes. And yet none of that matters, not really, because the entire purpose of this collection was never to be driven. It was to exist, to gleam, to be glimpsed by a visiting reporter and mentioned, in passing, in whatever article inevitably gets written about you next. You walk the row the way a general might inspect troops he does not fully trust. Here is the one purchased at 2 in the morning, after a conversation with a salesman who understood with total clarity what kind of night you were having. You cannot recall its top speed. You have never come close to testing it. Your actual daily commute covers less distance than a brisk walk, taken at a pace that would embarrass a delivery bicycle. But knowing, somewhere in the back of your mind, that the machine could launch you toward the horizon if you ever dared, that knowledge alone provides a strange and difficult to justify comfort. If modern comparisons fail you here, that is only because there has never quite been anything like it before. It is something like collecting rare stamps, except each stamp costs as much as a modest house and can, in theory, exceed the speed limit by a factor of 3. It is something like filling a private library with books written in a language you cannot read, purchased entirely for how their spines catch the light. You are not really a driver anymore. You are a curator, tending a small kingdom of machines whose real job is to reassure you, each morning, that everything happening to you is actually real. You choose the car nearest the door, mostly because it is the one you remember how to start. The engine wakes with a growl that thrills you for roughly 4 seconds, right up until you remember that you are, in fact, only driving to work. The door lifts. Morning light spills in across all that patient, gleaming metal, a small private kingdom of things you can admire but barely use, and you pull out into the ordinary world, aware that you still have to get dressed, which in your current life is its own peculiar kind of theater. Chapter 3. The uniform of a man who answers to no one getting dressed, for you, has become something closer to a philosophical statement than a morning task. The look you have settled on, without ever consciously choosing it, might best be described as a small boy dressed for a camping trip who happens to also run a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Cargo shorts, deep enough to hide a small filing cabinet. A fleece vest, worn indoors in summer, for reasons that have less to do with temperature and more to do with identity. Sandals, occasionally over socks, without a flicker of shame. a t-shirt from a conference you technically attended, though you remember almost nothing about it beyond the tote bag. This is not laziness. You have told yourself more than once. This is a statement. And the statement, roughly translated, is that you have become so important, so relentlessly busy, so cosmically essential to the future of commerce, that a belt has simply become beneath your consideration. Remarkably, everyone around you seems to accept this reasoning without argument. Your closet, when you glance into it, is vast, larger, certainly, than the bedroom you grew up sharing with a sibling. Along one wall hang suits, genuinely beautiful ones, tailored by a man who once flew in specifically to take your measurements. They wait there in the dark, plastic-wrapped, attending meetings only in spirit since you have not worn one in months. Somewhere in that closet you are fairly sure is a necktie. You have never located it. You have never truly searched. Getting dressed, door to door, takes perhaps 90 seconds, roughly 90 seconds longer than you would prefer. The cargo shorts, when you pull them on, already contain the debris of a life lived at speed. A half-eaten granola bar, a tangled cable connected to nothing you currently own, a business card belonging to a person whose face you cannot quite place, and one small screw whose origin you suspect but cannot confirm. The fleece vest goes on over the shirt, a garment so central to your sense of self that you own it in 6 identical colors and have never once explained why. Consider, for a moment, the meeting waiting for you later this afternoon, with men in suits so precisely pressed they could double as cutlery. They will sit across from you in thousands of dollars of careful tailoring, and you will arrive from the parking lot in shorts and sandals, and they will treat you, without irony, like visiting royalty. Because everyone in that room understands something simple. The man in the fleece vest is the one holding the future, or at least a very convincing story about it, and a suit cannot compete with that kind of leverage. There is, admittedly, a flaw hiding inside this whole philosophy, one you notice most sharply on colder mornings, when the sandals betray you and the office air conditioning finds your toes with unerring precision. Humanity, it turns out, invented the sock and the sensible shoe for reasons you are only now beginning to relearn slowly, the hard way. But comfort is the entire point. Rebellion is the entire point. Looking as though you rolled directly out of bed and into a fortune, that, more than anything else, is the entire performance. Fully dressed now in the quiet armor of a man who owns no iron, you head for the kitchen, because there is one more ritual waiting before the real day can begin, and it is disguised, unconvincingly, as breakfast. Chapter 4. Breakfast, or the art of refusing food. The kitchen you step into is, by any reasonable measure, a marvel. Cold stone counters, steel surfaces polished to a shine, a bank of ovens arranged with the seriousness of a restaurant that has earned its reputation over decades rather than months. There is a rack of knives near the window, each one sharpened by a professional who takes the edge of a blade almost personally, and a chef standing at the center of it all who trained somewhere genuinely impressive and could, if you asked, produce nearly any dish on earth before lunch. And yet, this morning, as on every morning this month, you have asked him for the shake. You picked up the idea somewhere over the Atlantic, half reading a paperback business book between naps on a flight you cannot now recall the destination of. Somewhere in its pages was a chapter suggesting that food, as most people understand it, is essentially an inefficiency, a bug in the human machine, waiting to be optimized away. It lodged itself in your brain the way certain bad ideas do, and it has not left since. Now you do not eat breakfast. You consume inputs. You have theories about the timing of your inputs, opinions about their biochemistry, and a habit of using the word optimize in reference to a piece of fruit, without any apparent embarrassment. The chef mixes the shake in near silence, his expression the particular blend of professional patience and quiet grief that comes from watching real skill go unused, day after day. In service of a beige liquid whose flavor lands somewhere between wet cardboard and a rainy afternoon. It contains, as far as you understand it, one powder that promises focus, another that promises energy, and a third whose exact purpose nobody, including you, can fully explain, added mostly because the label looked serious enough to justify the price. You drink it standing at the counter because sitting down to eat, you have decided, is a luxury reserved for people with time to spare, despite the fact that you have, at this exact moment, absolutely nowhere to be for at least another hour. There is a quiet, unnoticed absurdity in it. A man who could summon any dish the world has ever produced, delivered warm to a table overlooking his own garden, choosing instead to drink a glass of expensive dust while a trained professional stands 3 feet away, aching to cook for him. It is a little like owning a concert hall and only ever using it to store folding chairs. Late at night, when the discipline loosens its grip a little, you have been known to creep back into this same kitchen and eat cold leftovers standing over the sink, like a man raiding his own refrigerator in secret, and it is without question the happiest you feel all week. But that is not a story you tell anyone. In daylight in front of others, you are a man of discipline, a visionary who has transcended the ordinary human need for flavor. You finish the shake. Your body does not feel optimized. If anything, it feels faintly betrayed. But you set the glass down with the quiet satisfaction of a job completed, grab your keys from the counter, and head for the door, because somewhere across town, a building that you technically own is waiting for you to arrive and pretend to run it. Chapter 5. 12 minutes to building you own. There is something almost comic in the phrase going to work when the work in question belongs entirely to you. You could, with a single phone call, cancel the entire day. Instead, you fold yourself into the driver's seat of whichever car is closest to the door this morning, and you drive 12 unremarkable minutes across town like any other commuter, except this particular commuter happens to be worth, on paper at least, more money than most small nations generate in a year. Traffic, it turns out, does not care about your net worth. The radio plays a song you know every word to and will absolutely deny knowing later. You practice at red lights, the particular expression of a man gazing thoughtfully toward a horizon only he can see, distant, faintly troubled, entirely performative. And somewhere along this same 12-minute stretch, a small quiet voice at the back of your mind asks, gently, the same question it asks nearly every single morning. What exactly does the company actually do again? The car smells of leather, and the faint chemical trace of whatever solution the dealer sprays to make it smell that way. You pull out past gates and hedges belonging to neighbors who became wealthy at almost the exact same moment you did, doing things none of you can fully explain to your own parents at holiday dinners. The morning is bright. The road is smooth. And despite the fleet gathering dust in your garage, you find yourself sitting at the same red light as everyone else, drumming your fingers against a steering wheel worth more than most weddings. This, nobody warned you, is the great equalizer of sudden wealth. Money can buy the mansion, the fleet, the shake, the sandals, but it cannot buy an empty road. A delivery van cuts in front of you without apology, driven by someone who has no idea and would likely not care that the man they just inconvenienced could purchase their entire route. You brake. You wait. You are forced briefly and uncomfortably to be an ordinary person trapped inside an extraordinary car, and something about that grates on you in a way you would never admit aloud. So you do what you always do when the world refuses to acknowledge your importance. You reach for the phone. It hardly matters who you call, or about what. The point of the call is the calling itself, the visible performance of busyness, of being a man far too valuable to simply sit quietly in traffic like anyone else. You say things like "let's circle back and touch base and take this offline," phrases that mean almost nothing but sound somehow like they cost money. The person on the other end is very possibly eating cereal. You gesture at the windshield as though sealing a deal that will be written about for years. The radio, meanwhile, keeps playing a song you secretly adore, and you mouth a word or two at the red light before catching yourself and rearranging your face back into something more appropriately visionary. In truth, you are thinking about the shake which has not settled well, and about the afternoon meeting you have not prepared for, and about your closest rival who was written up in the newspaper again this week, looking irritatingly pleased with himself. And there it is again, The question, unbidden, insisting on being asked. What does the company actually do? You know the shape of the answer the way you know the shape of a song heard years ago, familiar, present, but somehow just out of reach. You can pitch it flawlessly to a room full of investors, conjure gold from thin air on command, but here, alone, at a red light. For one honest, unguarded second, you are genuinely not sure. And that small flicker of uncertainty, more than anything else, is the true engine quietly humming beneath this entire era, beneath the confidence, the cash, and the cars. The light turns green. You put the question away, the way you always do, and drive the last few minutes toward the strange, sprawling, half-finished place where your fortune is supposedly, somehow, still being built. Chapter 6. A campus built for play, disguised as a company. You arrive not at an office, exactly, but at something the company insists on calling a campus. A word chosen deliberately, because it sounds far more educational than a building full of 20-somethings who have not seen daylight since spring actually deserves. Before you reach anything resembling a desk, you must first pass the foosball table, the ping-pong table, an arcade machine nobody has ever seen turned off, and a kitchen stocked with free snacks that you personally approved during what was, on paper, a very serious budget meeting. There are beanbags scattered like fallen fruit across the open floor. There is a nap pod shaped like a small pale egg. There is a scooter, ridden at speed between meetings by someone whose job title you cannot currently recall. From the outside, it looks less like a functioning business and more like summer camp for adults who have somehow, through some accident of timing, become responsible for other people's retirement savings. You push through the glass doors and the noise reaches you before anything else does. The happy clatter of foosball rods, distant electronic chirps from the arcade, the low electric hum of perhaps 100 computers all working very hard on something you could not, if pressed, name with total confidence. The air smells of fresh coffee, warm bagels, and the faint plasticky newness of a building that did not exist 18 months ago. Everything is bright, primary colored, aggressively cheerful, the way things look when a corporation and a playground have had a child together and immediately given it a stock ticker. You wander through it the way a benevolent king might survey his strangest kingdom. Here is the wall of free cereal, 40 varieties, dispensed from clear plastic towers, installed after someone read that letting employees choose their own breakfast cereal boosts morale, and you believed them, and you paid for it without blinking. Here is an espresso bar staffed by an actual trained barista, because ordinary coffee, you have decided, is for ordinary companies. Here is the room stacked wall to wall with beanbags where, in theory, important decisions are meant to happen, though in practice people mostly just lie down and stare at the ceiling, quietly wondering, much like you do, what exactly the company does. The perks here have become something close to legend, and you are proud of every ridiculous one of them. Free lunch. Free dinner, free laundry, massages on Thursday afternoons, a game room, a music room that, as far as you can tell, nobody actually knows how to play, a slide, an honest-to-goodness slide installed between 2 floors at considerable expense, purely because a rival company down the street had one first, and you could not, in good conscience, allow yourself to be outdone. The reasoning behind all of it, which sounded perfectly airtight in the original meeting, runs roughly like this. Keep your people happy, fed, and thoroughly entertained, and they will never want to go home. And if they never want to go home, they will simply keep working indefinitely, cheerfully, forever. You have built, in effect, an extremely comfortable trap. And the truly astonishing part is how eagerly people are lining up to be caught in it. Walking through it feels strange, almost dreamlike. You pass a foosball match so intensely contested that 2 grown engineers are shouting at one another, possibly no longer on speaking terms outside the game. You pass the nap pod, its occupant either resting peacefully or hiding from a deadline, impossible from the outside to tell which. You pass an entire meeting taking place on beanbags, 4 people sunk so low into the floor that they appear to be conducting quarterly strategy from inside a shared hole in the ground. And you think with something close to genuine warmth that this exact scene is what winning looks like. Beneath all the noise, of course, there is real talent quietly at work. Brilliant engineers writing genuinely clever code, building things that may, one distant day, actually matter. It is easy, in a building like this, to forget them entirely, tucked away behind the free cereal and the foosball rivalries, carrying the whole enterprise forward on their shoulders while everyone else debates cereal selection policy. You make a mental note to thank them properly, someday soon. The note joins a long, quiet graveyard of other such notes. For now, you take a bagel you will not eat, nod at a barista whose name you have never learned, and head toward your desk, past all of this glorious, catered, beanbagged chaos. Because somewhere in this building, real work is supposedly happening today, or at least the technology that is meant to be doing it. And that technology, as you are about to be reminded, runs almost entirely on hope, patience, and a sound that will haunt your memory for the rest of your life. Chapter 7. The sound of the future. Connecting to reach the internet at all, you must first summon it, and summoning it requires a sound, a genuinely unholy chorus of screeches, static bursts, and electronic warbling that has come, in this decade, to mean please wait, the future is arriving slowly. The modem takes the better part of a minute simply to connect. It takes another full minute after that to load a single image, which arrives not all at once but one thin horizontal strip at a time, the way a fax might, if a fax had somehow developed a sense of dramatic packing. If anyone else in the building happens to pick up a telephone receiver while you are online, the entire connection collapses instantly, without warning or apology. And this, you tell serious investors with a completely straight face, is the very technology that will one day replace shopping malls entirely. You sit at your desk, crack your knuckles, and begin the ritual. You click to connect. The modem clears its throat, and then the sound begins, first a dial tone, then a series of urgent electronic beeps, then a long, harsh hiss, and finally a burst of static so violent it sounds like two machines arguing somewhere deep inside a blender. It continues for the better part of a minute, during which there is nothing to do but sit, wait, and quietly age. When the connection finally lands, a small triumphant chime rings out, and you feel, for one brief moment, something close to the satisfaction of a mountaineer reaching a summit. You are online. You are, as far as anyone in this building is concerned, jacked directly into the future, and the future, it turns out, intends to make you wait a good deal longer still. You click open a page, one of your own, the supposed crown jewel of your entire empire, and it begins to load the way honey moves in winter. Text arrives first, blocky and gray. Then slowly an image begins to render, one thin horizontal line at a time, top to bottom, so that for a solid 30 seconds you genuinely cannot tell whether you are looking at a sunset or a golden retriever. It is, until the final line locks into place, entirely ambiguous. The fragility of the whole system is almost sacred. Every connection travels down the exact same telephone line the building uses for ordinary phone calls, which means the internet and the telephone exist in a state of permanent, bitter rivalry, unable to coexist for more than a few minutes at a stretch. Should anyone across the office lift a receiver to order lunch, your connection dies instantly, without mercy, and the entire screeching ritual must begin again from nothing. You have sent memos about this. You have personally begged colleagues not to touch the phones during important uploads. It has not helped. The betrayal always arrives exactly when you least expect it. And yet, this is the truly remarkable part. You believe. You believe with your whole chest. You look at this sluggish, screeching, endlessly interruptible connection. A system that struggles to load a single photograph of a dog before lunchtime, and somehow you see with total clarity the entire future of human commerce. You walk into rooms full of serious men holding checkbooks and tell them without a flicker of doubt that one day people will do all of their shopping through exactly this. Their groceries, their furniture, their household goods, everything delivered through the magic of the screech. They lean forward. They nod along. They believe it too, which is either a symptom of some shared collective madness, or unnervingly a genuine glimpse of something real. Because here is the quiet joke sitting at the center of this entire decade. You are right. Completely, almost absurdly right. You are simply far too early, like a man arriving at a party a full decade before the music actually starts, insisting to anyone who will listen that it is about to be extraordinary. The future you are describing is coming. It simply cannot travel down this particular wire, at this particular speed, interrupted by every lunch order placed in the building. You are trying to run tomorrow's economy on today's phone line, and the wire, to its credit, is doing its noble, screeching best. The page finally finishes loading the retriever, or perhaps the sunset, revealing itself at last, and you lean back, satisfied, a pioneer standing at the edge of a frontier that mostly, for now, consists of waiting. Chapter 8. The weight of being reachable. No self-respecting figure of this decade leaves the house without an arsenal of devices, and yours, though heavy and largely inefficient, are non-negotiable. Your cell phone weighs about as much as a brick and holds its charge for roughly the length of one confident phone call. Your pager buzzes constantly, clipped proudly to your belt, delivering numbers you rarely recognize and almost never call back. And then there is the crown jewel of the collection, a small glowing tablet you write on with a plastic stylus, using a simplified alphabet you had to learn the way a child learns cursive, one careful stroke at a time. Begin with the phone, if it can even be called that, given how closely it resembles a construction material. It is black, heavy, and topped with a stubby antenna you must sometimes pull free with your teeth when your hands are occupied. It fits comfortably in no pocket you own. It has left a permanent dent in the lining of every bag you have owned since. When it rings, which happens rarely, since remarkably few people currently have a number to reach you on, the whole device rumbles like a small, irritated animal. You answer it with a small performance of ceremony, standing, walking to somewhere visible, because a man seen speaking into a mobile telephone this decade is a man to be reckoned with, and being reckoned with, you have decided, matters more than you'd like to admit. The battery is its own quiet cruelty. Fully charged, it grants you perhaps one meaningful conversation before dying instantly and completely, with no warning at all, the way a person might faint. So you carry a spare battery, a car charger, a wall charger, and a low, constant hum of anxiety about power that follows you everywhere you go. You have ended important calls early purely to preserve battery for calls that never actually arrive. More than once you have held a completely dead phone to your ear in public, purely for the image of the thing. You are not proud of this. You are not entirely ashamed of it either. Then there is the pager, buzzing steadily against your hip like a badge of honor, delivering a stream of numbers that mean almost nothing to you. Someone, somewhere, wants a call back. You rarely provide one, in part because you cannot always tell whether the number belongs to an investor, an assistant, a wrong number, or the delivery driver confirming an order you have already forgotten placing. But the buzzing, in its own strange way, makes you feel wanted, needed, essential, briefly important, even when the buzzing is, in truth, often nothing more than a misdialed fax machine. And finally, the true pride of the collection, a small dark tablet that fits neatly in your palm, a personal digital assistant, a phrase you say with something close to reverence. You keep your calendar on it. You keep your contacts on it. You write on it with a small plastic stylus, in a simplified alphabet designed specifically so the machine can understand your handwriting. And you have genuinely spent real evenings practicing your letters, like a grown multimillionaire relearning penmanship, so that a device the size of a coaster will correctly recognize the word meeting. The great, quiet irony, obvious to everyone but you, is that all three devices combined, the brick, the pager, the glowing tablet with its private alphabet, accomplish marginally less than a small paper notebook and a pen you could buy for pocket change. The notebook never loses its charge. The notebook never dies mid-sentence. The notebook does not require you to learn a private script simply to write down an appointment. But the notebook does not beep, does not glow, and does not announce to a crowded room that its owner is living somewhere near the very edge of tomorrow. So you carry the gadgets anyway, heavy, needy, and blinking, because they are not really tools at all. They are jewelry for men who have decided to believe in the future with their whole chest. You pat your belt once, reassured by the modest arsenal weighing you down, and turn your attention to the one document that is supposedly holding this entire glittering enterprise together. Or rather, to the fact that nobody in the building can currently locate it. Chapter 9. The plan nobody has ever actually seen somewhere, presumably. A real business plan exists, an actual document with actual pages, describing precisely how this company intends to eventually make money. Everyone in the building refers to it constantly. Nobody, as far as you can tell, has laid eyes on it in months. The plan, as far as institutional memory serves, lives in a drawer somewhere. It is spoken of the way a legend is spoken of. When pressed on the matter, you explain, calmly and with total conviction, that profit is simply not the point right now. That the focus is growth, market share, the sheer capturing of attention. Phrases that sound very much like strategy while functioning mostly as vibes wearing a well-tailored suit. The plainer truth, whispered occasionally in the hum of the server room, is considerably simpler. Get large, look important, and hope that the question of money sorts itself out sometime later, preferably after everyone involved has already become rich. It did exist once, you are fairly certain, back when the company was 3 people and a genuinely good feeling. Someone typed it. Someone printed it. It contained a handful of graphs, climbing hopefully upward, and a chapter near the back. The chapter about revenue that everyone agreed at the time to finish writing later. Nobody ever did. That document now sits somewhere in this building, in a drawer or a folder, possibly misplaced entirely during the last office expansion. A sacred text that everyone cites confidently, and nobody can actually produce on request. When investors ask about it directly, and occasionally they do, you have developed a small, elegant performance for the occasion. You lean back. You steeple your fingers. You explain warmly that in the old economy, yes, a company once worried about small matters like spending less than it earned, but that this is a new economy with new rules and the old arithmetic simply no longer applies. You speak of market share. You speak of first-mover advantage. You speak, above all, of network effects, a phrase you have grown to love precisely because it sounds deeply scientific and is nearly impossible for anyone in the room to actually verify. The genius of the whole performance, if genius is the right word for it, is that it works because everyone in the room quietly wants it to work. The investors, if pressed honestly, do not want to see the real numbers either. Numbers are stubborn things, and if anyone actually sat down and read them carefully, they might notice that a company spending $10 to earn $1 is not, in any traditional sense, a sound long-term strategy. So an unspoken agreement settles quietly over every room like this one. Nobody asks the hard question because nobody, deep down, particularly wants to hear the honest answer. Inside the building itself, the whole operation runs largely on faith and forward momentum. Engineers build, marketers market. Salespeople sell products at prices that lose money on every single transaction, cheerfully, because the unwritten plan has always been to make it up eventually in volume. A phrase, incidentally, that has quietly ended more companies throughout history than fire and flood combined. When a nervous new hire asks, gently, exactly how the business intends to become profitable, they are met with the warm, slightly glazed smiles of people who long ago learned to stop asking the same question themselves. Eventually, most of them stop asking too and learn instead to love the growth. And growth, this is the maddening part, is entirely real. The numbers genuinely do climb. More users, more traffic, more attention, more press coverage, more parties, more of everything, all of it rising together in one great intoxicating rush that feels, in the moment, indistinguishable from actual success, while costing, quietly, exactly like a catastrophe still gathering somewhere just out of view. You are getting bigger, every single day, the way a balloon gets bigger, thrilling, swelling, and one sharp, unexpected moment away from a very loud noise. But that particular worry belongs to some colder future morning. This morning is warm and bright, and thoroughly full of momentum, and all you need now, really, is a little more money to keep the whole glorious machine turning over. Money in this particular decade turns out to be remarkably easy to summon, provided you walk into the right room, wearing the right amount of confidence, holding the right graph, the one that climbs up and to the right forever without ever quite explaining why. Chapter 10. The room where belief becomes currency. Today you perform one of the era's oldest and strangest rituals, the pitch, in which you sit in a beautiful glass-walled room and persuade a group of serious, tanned men to hand you an almost obscene quantity of cash. You bring no proof. You bring energy. You draw a graph climbing up and to the right, deliberately without numbers on either axis, because numbers in this particular room are limiting. You describe your small, unprofitable website as a platform, an ecosystem, a movement. And the truly astonishing part, the part that would make your own grandparents faint clean away, is that it works. The room itself is designed deliberately to make ordinary visitors feel small, which is precisely why you swagger into it wearing sandals. It sits high inside a glass tower, overlooking the whole valley spread out below like a kingdom laid out for inspection. The table is a single slab of polished wood, roughly the size of a canoe. The chairs cost more than your first year's salary ever did. Around that table sit the venture capitalists, calm, tanned, quietly dangerous men who became wealthy by being right just often enough, and who are now hunting patiently for the next impossible thing to be right about. You do not sit quietly and wait to be questioned. You perform. You stand near the front of the room. You gesture at your graph, that beautiful ascending line, unburdened by any actual figures, and you begin, sentence by sentence, to construct an entire imagined world using nothing but your own voice. You reach for the industry's favorite words, the ones that have quietly launched 1,000 fortunes before yours: revolutionize, disrupt, platform, ecosystem, scale. You do not explain in any real detail how the company intends to make money, because that has never really been the deal in this particular room. The deal is that you make them feel the future arriving somewhere behind their ribs, and let their own imaginations quietly fill in whatever boring details remain. The trick, though you would call it vision rather than a trick, is total, seamless, unshakable confidence. You cannot flinch. You cannot hedge. The moment you show even a flicker of doubt, the room will sense it the way a dog senses fear, and the whole spell collapses instantly. So you speak about your unproven, unprofitable company as though its eventual success were already a settled historical fact, waiting patiently for the rest of the world to catch up. You are not, in this framing, asking anyone for money. You are generously offering them a rare chance to become part of something enormous. And if they hesitate even slightly, you let it hang gently in the air that your closest rival happens to be pitching just down the hall this same afternoon, and it works. Genuinely, almost absurdly, it works. Somewhere around the point where you describe the eventual size of the market, a figure so large it stops meaning anything specific at all, you watch the shift happen behind their eyes, skepticism quietly giving way to hunger. The questions stop. The nodding begins. One of them leans toward another and murmurs something you cannot quite hear but can absolutely feel in the room's changing temperature. You have summoned a fortune out of pure belief, conjured real money from a graph with no numbers on it at all. The check, when it finally arrives, is staggering, a figure with so many zeros that it stops resembling a payment and starts resembling a phone number. More money, in a single check, than your parents earned across their entire working lives combined. Handed over for a company that has never once turned a profit, on the strength of nothing more than a story and a fleece vest. They shake your hand warmly. They thank you, genuinely thank you, for the privilege of setting their money alight beside your own. You walk out of that glass tower floating, invincible, a magician who has just pulled an entire fortune from an empty hat in front of a room full of professionals who should, by every reasonable measure, have known better. The valley glitters below you on the drive back. The future feels, for the moment, not merely possible, but somehow already owed to you. And now comes the truly dangerous part, the part, if you are honest with yourself, that you were always best at. You have to go and spend it. And spending, as it turns out, is where the real artistry of this decade genuinely begins. Chapter 11. The fire that everyone calls ambition there is a phrase for how quickly you set investor money alight, and the industry, without a trace of irony, has chosen to call it the burn rate. You hire more people than the company currently needs. You purchase office chairs that individually cost more than a used car and swivel like something out of a dream. You pour money into advertising, into parties, into a lobby fish tank so extravagant it requires its own dedicated full-time employee. Every dollar that arrives goes racing straight back out again, faster each quarter, and everyone around you insists with total sincerity that this is exactly what healthy growth is supposed to look like. The language itself is telling. Not spending, not investment. Burning, the vocabulary of a bonfire, and yet everyone around the table says it with a smile, as though setting large sums of money on fire were some kind of proud national sport. You have a burn rate the way other, older companies once had a mission statement, and you quote it to investors like a badge of honor. We are burning through several $1 million a month, you announce, and instead of alarm, you receive approving nods because a high burn rate in this particular decade signals ambition. And ambition this year is worth considerably more than simple arithmetic, so you burn. You burn on office floors leased far beyond what the company currently needs, because leasing entire empty floors is simply what serious, ambitious companies are expected to do. You burn on furniture, ergonomic chairs, so advanced they arrive with printed instruction manuals, desks that rise and lower at the press of a button, a lobby designed by an actual licensed architect purely to impress visitors who, in practice, mostly just want to find the bathroom. You burn on the fish tank itself, a glowing tropical wall that serves no purpose beyond quietly announcing that a company with this much spare money to waste must surely know something the rest of the world does not yet understand. You burn on hearing, at a frenzied pace, filling the growing campus with new employees faster than you can invent meaningful work for half of them to do. You burn on snacks, on massages, on the train barista, on the slide connecting two floors. You burn on consultants, well-dressed, faintly mysterious people who arrive, nod gravely at your charts, and depart with a healthy portion of your money and a vague, comforting promise that things are, broadly, going well. You burn on branded merchandise, thousands of t-shirts and water bottles stamped proudly with your logo, distributed at conferences to strangers who quietly discard them in the parking lot on the way to their cars. The strangest part, if you're honest with yourself late at night, is how genuinely good all of it feels. Spending money you did not personally earn, on things the company does not strictly need, in pursuit of a future you cannot fully describe out loud, produces a warm chemical glow that is remarkably difficult to give up once you've felt it. Each purchase becomes its own small hit of confidence, tangible proof that you matter, that the company is real, that the story you keep telling investors is, in fact, true. A frugal company, you have come to believe, looks frightened. A company that spends freely looks certain of itself. And looking certain in this particular decade is the entire game being played. And the money, remarkably, keeps arriving. That is the true trap hidden inside the whole arrangement. Every time the fire begins to burn low, you simply return to a glass tower somewhere in the valley, tell the same story once more, draw the same ascending graph, and walk out again with a fresh pile to feed the flames. The burn feels sustainable precisely because it has always, so far, proven sustainable, right up until the exact moment it quietly stops being so. But that particular moment is nowhere in sight this month. This month the fire is roaring nicely. The fish are swimming contentedly behind their expensive glass. The chairs are swiveling on command, and everyone around you agrees, warmly and often, that you are some kind of genius. There is, however, one thing in this world that burns through money faster than a bloated payroll and a designer fish tank combined, and it happens to be sitting on the calendar for this very evening, glittering, pointless, and wildly expensive. It is time, once again, to throw a party. Chapter 12. A celebration of absolutely nothing. Not just any party, and certainly not one tied to any recognizable achievement. Perhaps you have shipped a minor software update. Perhaps it is simply a Tuesday. In this world, a party is never really a celebration. It is a strategy, a press release you happen to dance inside of. You rent a warehouse in an unfashionable stretch of town, vast and raw, and you pour money into it until, for one single night, it becomes the single most talked about room in the entire valley. The transformation itself is staggering. Lighting rigs descend from the rafters on cables nobody questions. A dance floor materializes where, 12 hours earlier, there was only concrete and dust. Ice sculptures stand in the corners, carved carefully into the shape of your company's logo, already weeping quietly under the heat of the lights, destined to become a small cold puddle well before midnight arrives. There are towers of food that nobody present will finish, shrimp piled on beds of crushed ice, cheeses flown in from countries you couldn't confidently point to on a map, a chocolate fountain serving no nutritional or spiritual purpose beyond looking gloriously excessive. The open bar pours cocktails named, without much creativity, after your own product, an idea somebody had late one afternoon that nobody had quite the heart to talk them out of. The band, when it takes the small stage near the back, is the true masterpiece of the whole extravagant evening. Musicians genuinely too famous for what is, on paper, a corporate gathering celebrating a minor product update. They know it. They play anyway because your money spends precisely the same as anyone else's. They perform to a crowd of tipsy engineers, opportunistic strangers who wandered in off the street, and a handful of journalists quietly collecting free drinks while barely watching the stage. And it costs more, this single evening, than most people's homes, and you consider it, without hesitation, money extremely well spent. The guests themselves remain something of a mystery. You recognize perhaps 1 in every 10 faces in the room. The rest belong to the ambient population that seems to materialize at every party exactly like this one. Friends of friends, hangers-on, people who somehow appear at every launch and every anniversary, congratulating everyone in sight on everything at once. They find you eventually in the crowd, shake your hand warmly, and tell you with total sincerity how visionary you are, how well the company is clearly doing, how thrilled they personally are for whatever comes next. You have never met most of them. They have never worked for you. Several of them, if pressed honestly, could not tell you what your company actually does, which places them in remarkably good company, since on a difficult day neither quite can you. And here sits the quiet absurdity at the center of it all. Standing in your own warehouse, surrounded by melting ice and famous musicians and strangers praising a success that exists, for now only on paper, you are throwing a coronation for a king who has not yet actually won his war. You are celebrating in advance, loudly and expensively, daring the future to prove you wrong before it has had a proper chance to weigh in. It is superstition dressed carefully as strategy. A bonfire built entirely from borrowed money, lit mainly to keep the darkness a little further away. You slip out before the band finishes its final set, more exhausted than the hour should reasonably explain, worn thin from an evening of smiling, shaking hands, and being told repeatedly how wonderful you are by people whose names you will likely never learn. The party continues without you long into the small hours, and it is declared, by everyone who mattered and plenty who didn't, an enormous triumph. Chapter 13. Hearing like adopting stray cats. The company is growing so quickly now that hearing has become less a process and more an instinct, impulsive, emotional, and largely unplanned, the way some people adopt stray animals off the street. Titles are invented on the spot in the middle of hallway conversations. Someone becomes a ninja. Someone else becomes a guru. Someone somehow becomes a wizard, a title that has apparently become a genuine, salaried job here. You hand out stock options the way other companies hand out holiday bonuses, casually, generously, promising future riches to a receptionist who, quietly doing the math at her own kitchen table one evening, realizes she may soon be considerably wealthier than her own landlord. Nobody is entirely certain what half these new hires do all day, including, on more than one occasion, the hires themselves. But the headcount climbs steadily, and climbing in this particular building has come to feel indistinguishable from actual progress, so the hearing simply continues. The logic, if it deserves to be called that, runs roughly as follows. Growth requires people. Therefore, more people must logically produce more growth, reasoning that sounds airtight right up until anyone examines it directly and for more than a few seconds. So you hire. You hire faster than you can furnish desks, which means new employees frequently spend their entire first week sitting cross-legged on the floor with a laptop balanced on their knees, being paid a generous salary to quietly wait for a chair to become available. You hire faster than you can invent meaningful work, which means entire teams exist for weeks in a pleasant fog, attending meetings about meetings, producing documents that nobody downstream will ever actually read, all quietly convinced that somewhere nearby, out of view, the real work must surely be happening. The job titles alone tell the whole story better than any org chart could. Ordinary companies have managers, coordinators, and directors. Yours has a code ninja, a growth guru, a happiness engineer, and one employee whose business card, printed at company expense, simply reads wizard without further elaboration. Nobody is quite sure what the wizard actually does. The wizard, if asked directly, is not entirely sure either. But the wizard is paid promptly, fed generously, given a beanbag of his own, and treated with the vague, unquestioning reverence typically reserved for anyone whose exact function has become too mysterious to challenge out loud. The real currency here, though, is not salary at all. It is stock options. And this is where the whole arrangement quietly tips into something close to poetry. You cannot always match the enormous salaries the outside market currently demands, so instead you pay in dreams, in small slices of the company itself, promise to be worth a genuine fortune once the great, inevitable success eventually arrives. You hand these options out generously to senior engineers and junior designers alike, and to the receptionist at the front desk, who takes the paperwork home, works through the numbers quietly over dinner, and realizes that if the story turns out to be true, if the balloon keeps rising the way everyone insists it will, she may soon be wealthier than the man who owns the very building she rents her apartment from. Everyone, in effect, becomes a shareholder, which means everyone becomes, almost automatically, a believer, which is precisely the point of the whole arrangement. A person who owns even a small piece of the dream works harder to protect it, stays later at their desk, forgives more of the daily chaos, and quietly ignores the small nagging voice that keeps asking how, exactly, any of this is supposed to eventually make money. You have not simply hired a workforce. You have recruited an entire congregation of believers, each one now financially bound to the same beautiful, uncertain gamble, each one now personally invested in never quite being the one to ask the obvious question out loud. Some of them are genuinely brilliant. Some are absolutely essential, the quiet few actually building the thing that might someday justify all of this noise and expense. And some of them are the wizard, drawing a steady salary for reasons that have long since faded into company folklore. At this point, in a crowd this large, moving at this speed, you have largely stopped trying to tell the difference. The headcount is a number, and the number keeps climbing, and up in this building remains the only direction anyone still believes in. Chapter 14. Leadership from a Beanbag. Your particular method of running the company is, like everything else about you, deeply unconventional and delivered more often than not from very close to the ground. You do not believe in private offices, in strict hierarchies, in printed memos, or in wearing shoes indoors. You believe instead in energy. You conduct important meetings from inside a beanbag chair that slowly, steadily swallows you as the discussion continues, forcing your senior staff to direct serious budget decisions toward a man gently sinking, inch by inch, into the floor. You use words like synergy and disrupt and paradigm with the total confidence of a preacher and the actual precision of a fog machine. Your employees adore you mostly and follow your vision faithfully, mostly, if we're being honest, because you happen to be the one holding the checkbook. And a checkbook in this particular economy proves remarkably persuasive on its own. You have rejected the old office model entirely. Private offices with doors, you have decided, imply hierarchy, and hierarchy is the natural enemy of energy. So you have torn down most of the interior walls, quite literally, creating one vast open floor where everyone can technically see everyone else. And as a direct consequence, almost nobody can concentrate on anything for very long. You do not keep a private office of your own. You have a beanbag, a large, slouching sack of foam positioned in the middle of the general chaos, from which you conduct the affairs of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars while slowly and inexorably sinking, inch by patient inch, toward the carpet beneath you. Meetings themselves are, in their own way, something to behold. You gather your most senior people, your ninjas, your gurus, around the low altar of a cluster of beanbags, and everyone lowers themselves onto the floor with wildly varying degrees of remaining dignity. Executives in their 30s fold themselves down onto the carpet like schoolchildren gathering for story time. From roughly ankle height, you discuss quarterly spending, hearing targets, and the long-term future of the entire enterprise. Someone attempts to present a genuinely serious financial concern while lying at a 45-degree angle, gradually losing a quiet battle against gravity, and it becomes almost impossible for anyone in the room to take the moment fully seriously, which may, in its own strange way, be the entire point. Your vocabulary functions as its own management system. You have collected over time a glittering pile of words that sound profound and mean on close inspection, almost nothing at all, and you deploy them constantly with total conviction. You want to leverage synergies. You want to disrupt the paradigm. You want to think outside the box, move the needle, and circle back on the low-hanging fruit. Strung together, your sentences carry all the rhythm of genuine wisdom and roughly the substance of morning fog. And yet people nod along. People write it down in their notebooks. People leave the beanbag genuinely inspired, despite being entirely unable to repeat back a single concrete instruction you actually gave them. And the strange truth is that, for now at least, it works. Beneath all the buzzwords and the foam beads, you do possess something real, a kind of relentless, genuinely contagious belief that seems to infect nearly everyone who spends enough time around you. You are not managing through spreadsheets or discipline or clearly written instructions. You are managing through sheer, unfiltered enthusiasm, functioning as a one-man pep rally, a man so entirely certain of the glorious future ahead that his certainty becomes its own quiet gravity, pulling everyone nearby into orbit around your beanbag. It helps enormously, of course, that you happen to sign the checks. It is remarkably easy to adore a visionary whose vague, inspiring speeches are attached to a very real and rapidly growing pile of stock options. Loyalty flows freely when the checkbook stays open, and yours is open almost constantly, gushing steadily. So your people forgive the fog, embrace the beanbags without complaint, and follow you happily toward a horizon that none of them, if pressed honestly, could actually describe in any detail. You heave yourself up out of the beanbag at the end of the meeting, a small, undignified struggle that undoes a fair portion of the visionary mystique you spent the last hour building, and you feel in that moment like the captain of a very strange, very happy ship. And soon, that ship is due to arrive at the single most magical moment of the entire voyage, the day the whole world agrees, all at once, and for no entirely clear reason, that you are worth an absolute fortune. Chapter 15. The Bell. And now, the moment the entire voyage has quietly been building toward, the day your company finally goes public, and the whole financial world agrees in near unison to treat you as though you are worth a genuinely staggering sum of money. This is the initial public offering, the grandest magic trick the entire show has to offer. You ring a small physical bell. People clap. A number appears on a screen and immediately doubles. Then it doubles again, for reasons nobody in the room can fully articulate. And just like that, before lunch has even properly begun, you are a paper billionaire. You have still, at this point, never turned an actual profit. You still could not confidently explain in plain language exactly what the company does. But the market has spoken, loudly and with genuine enthusiasm, and the market has decided for now that you are a genius. The days leading up to this morning are a blur of bankers, lawyers, and men in unmistakably real suits who suddenly, almost overnight, begin taking you very seriously indeed. There is a roadshow, a whirlwind tour through city after city, where you stand in hotel conference rooms and tell the same story again and again. The graph, the platform, the coming revolution, delivered to rooms full of investors eager to get in before the doors officially open. You are exhausted. You are, at the same time, genuinely exhilarated. You have told this particular story so many times now that you have nearly stopped hearing the individual words, and it no longer matters, because everyone in every room has already, quietly, decided to believe it. Then comes the morning itself. You stand on the trading floor, or a close approximation of one, surrounded by cameras, cheering employees and bankers whose smiles look bright enough to power the entire building. There is a bell, an actual physical bell, and you are handed the honor of ringing it. And you do. And the sound marks the precise instant your private gamble becomes a fully public spectacle. The market opens. Your stock, priced modestly the night before by a room full of cautious men, is set loose into the wild, and the wild responds with something close to madness. The number on the screen, the price of a single share in your unprofitable dream, does not simply rise. It erupts. It doubles within minutes, then keeps climbing faster still, a green line rocketing upward with a velocity that has nothing whatsoever to do with earnings or revenue, or the ordinary gravity of a functioning business, and everything to do with pure, giddy, contagious want. People are buying because the price is climbing. And the price is climbing because people are buying, a perfectly self-feeding loop of enthusiasm, entirely untethered from anything you could ever put in a ledger. You watch the screen, and somewhere in the blur of rising digits, you become, at least on paper, a billionaire. Not in cash, not in anything you could actually hold in your hand, but in the strange new arithmetic of this particular boom. Your slice of the company is now worth more money than you can genuinely comprehend. A figure with so many zeros attached that it stops feeling like money at all, and starts feeling instead like weather, something to be observed rather than owned. Your employees, your ninjas, your gurus, the wizard, the receptionist with her kitchen table arithmetic, are watching the very same screen, and they are becoming rich alongside you, and the entire building erupts into a joy that feels completely genuine and almost entirely detached from ordinary reason. Cameras find you. Reporters shout questions from across the floor. And you stand there in your fleece vest, a man who could not have told you last week exactly how the company earns a single dollar, now anointed by the largest, most serious financial machinery in the world as a visionary, a titan, a bona fide genius. Nobody rang that bell today to celebrate profit, because there is none to celebrate. They rang it to celebrate belief. And on this particular morning, in this particular decade, belief is worth more than any factory or product or plan you could actually point to. It is, without question, the best day of your life. And every last bit of it is made entirely of paper, because the fortune that has just landed on you is real in precisely the way a rainbow is real. Dazzling, undeniable, and when you actually try to reach out and touch it, entirely impossible to hold. Chapter 16, A Fortune Made of Weather. Here is the strange and slippery truth sitting quietly beneath your fortune. Almost none of it is real, at least not in the way rent is real, or groceries are real, or a paycheck cashed at the bank is real. You are worth, on paper, hundreds of millions of dollars, a number that lives entirely on a screen, and that number changes its mind constantly, sometimes by the hour. You cannot spend most of it. You cannot touch most of it. If you tried to convert all of it into actual cash at once, the whole delicate illusion holding up the stock price would very likely wobble and collapse. So you find yourself, somehow, simultaneously one of the wealthiest people in the entire country, and also a man who still feels a small, genuine thrill whenever a cup of coffee turns out to be free. The number itself, when you sit with it for a moment, is genuinely staggering. Multiply your shares by the price currently glowing on the screen, and you arrive at a figure that belongs somewhere in an encyclopedia rather than a bank statement. A fortune that would have made the industrial tycoons of an earlier century choke on their cigars in disbelief. On paper, you could buy almost anything on earth. On paper, you are a titan. And that small phrase, on paper, does more quiet, heavy lifting than anyone at your celebration dinner last night wanted to openly admit. Because paper is exactly what it is, a promise, a possibility, a number that only truly becomes money at the precise moment you try to convert it into money, and often, inconveniently, not even then. You cannot simply cash any of it in. Nearly all of your wealth exists as your own company stock, and both the rules and plain common sense forbid you from selling much of it just yet. There are lockup periods, long stretches of time during which a founder is legally barred from selling even a single share. Because if the very person who built the company began quietly dumping stock, the market would panic instantly, the price would collapse, and the whole beautiful illusion would deflate within a single afternoon. So you sit at the top of this enormous mountain of value, forbidden from actually touching most of it. A starving man locked inside his own pantry, richer on paper than a small nation, and unable to freely spend more than a modest fraction of what the headlines claim you're worth. Worse still, the number simply refuses to hold still. Your fortune breathes along with the market, swelling and shrinking by the hour, tens of millions of dollars appearing and vanishing again while you sit through a routine lunch meeting. You check the screen once, and you are worth a little more. You check it again an hour later, and you are worth considerably less, a sum larger than most people earn across an entire lifetime, having simply evaporated somewhere between your soup and your sandwich, for reasons that usually amount to little more than a rumor, a passing mood, or a headline about interest rates you do not fully understand. Your wealth, in other words, is not really a possession at all. It is closer to a weather system, and you live inside it entirely at its mercy. The resulting psychology is genuinely absurd, and would be funny if it were happening to somebody else. By every newspaper headline, you are one of the wealthiest people currently living in the country, and yet your actual day-to-day life is still riddled with the small, frugal instincts of someone who has not quite internalized any of it. You still feel a small flicker of victory whenever a coffee turns out to be complimentary. You still hesitate just briefly before paying for parking. Your real bank account, the one with actual spendable cash sitting in it, is healthy, certainly comfortable, but nothing remotely close to the mythical figure that follows your name through every article written about you. You are, at once, both a billionaire and a man quietly counting the bills in his own wallet, and both of these things are, somehow, entirely true at the same time. This is the great, quiet secret of the boom, whispered occasionally among founders honest enough to admit it aloud. The fortunes are real and unreal all at once, dazzling on the page, and locked away in a vault you are not yet permitted to open. 100 imaginary millions tied to a very thin string you are simultaneously terrified to let go of, and equally terrified to pull too hard. You are holding, in effect, the single most valuable balloon in the entire world, and its whole worth depends entirely on the crowd around you continuing to believe it will keep floating. And so, to quiet the low hum of anxiety this arrangement produces, you do the one thing that reliably turns the fear back into something resembling a thrill. You begin, almost without noticing, to watch the number. Chapter 17. The number that measures your soul. A new habit has crept quietly into your daily life, gentle at first, and then, before you've fully noticed, entirely consuming. You cannot stop checking the stock price. It sits open on your computer screen. It scrolls along a small ticker device you keep on your desk purely for this purpose. It is the very first thing you look at each morning, and the very last thing you see each night, glowing softly beside your bed like a small financial nightlight. When the number climbs, you feel invincible, brilliant, chosen by something larger than yourself. When it dips, even slightly, your stomach drops and you find yourself quietly bargaining with an invisible universe. You refresh the page. You refresh it again a few seconds later. Nothing has changed in the intervening 9 seconds, and you refresh it anyway, because somewhere along the way, without quite realizing it, the number stopped simply measuring your company and started measuring your soul instead. It began innocently enough, a glance in the morning, a check at lunchtime, the ordinary curiosity of a man watching his own creation trade openly in the wild for the first time. But curiosity, left unchecked long enough, has a way of quietly curdling into compulsion. The glance has become a stare. The stare has become, gradually and almost without your permission, a permanent state of being. Your computer keeps the price open in a window that never closes. A second monitor updates it live, constantly, in the corner of your vision. Somewhere on your desk sits a small, dedicated device whose only function is to feed you this same number, in a slow, hypnotic crawl, all day long. You love it and resent it in almost exactly equal measure. The number, more than anything else now, owns your moods, and it owns them completely. On a green morning when the price ticks upward, you feel magnificent. You walk taller through the hallways. You are generous to the barista, warm toward your engineers, expansive and full of easy confidence during your beanbag meetings, a benevolent genius, blessing his own small kingdom, because the screen has once again confirmed, in the clearest possible terms, that you are right about everything. The rising number functions almost like a drug, a pure hit of validation, and you chase that particular feeling all day, refreshing constantly, watching the digits climb, savoring each small increase as fresh personal proof of your own brilliance. But the market, as it turns out, is a fickle god, and the red days always come eventually. The number dips, sometimes only slightly, a rounding error really in the grand scheme of things, and your entire nervous system lurches, the way it might on a rapidly falling elevator. Your stomach drops. You lean in toward the screen and begin the small, private, faintly shameful mathematics of the anxious newly rich, calculating precisely how many imaginary millions have just evaporated from your imaginary fortune. And it feels, absurdly, like a real and deeply personal wound. You begin bargaining quietly with no one in particular, silently promising the universe you will be good, generous, humble, if only the line on the screen would please turn green again. Then comes the refreshing itself, the true madness hiding underneath all of it. You reload the page. Nothing has changed. You reload it again 9 seconds later. Still nothing. You know intellectually with total clarity that simply staring at the number cannot possibly move it, that your undivided attention has no measurable effect whatsoever on the open market. And yet your finger keeps twitching toward the button, again and again, a small nervous tick, a compulsion, not unlike a person repeatedly checking a wound to see whether it still hurts. It does. It always does. The worst part, if you're being fully honest with yourself, is what all of this has quietly done to your own sense of self. The number was only ever meant to measure the company, a cold, external verdict handed down by the open market on the health of your business. But somewhere along the way, the wires crossed entirely, and now it measures you instead, your worth, your intelligence, your very right to feel good about your own life on any given day. On a green day, you are a visionary. On a red day, you are quietly, privately, a fraud. Your entire mood, your ego, your whole fragile sense of who you are, now rises and falls with a jittery green line that has, in truth, almost nothing to do with anything you personally did today. Eventually, you tear your eyes away from the screen, because there is somewhere else you need to be, a decision waiting to be signed off on, another glorious way to spend money in pursuit of the very fame that keeps this number climbing in the first place. And this particular idea happens to be your most expensive one yet, involving the single biggest stage in the entire country, and improbably a puppet. Chapter 18. A sock becomes a star. To truly become a household name, you decide on the most sensible possible use of your investors' money, purchasing the single most expensive advertisement on the entire planet, a commercial airing during the biggest game of the year, watched by tens of millions of people, costing more than most Americans will earn across a lifetime, all to promote a website that has, once again, never actually turned a profit. And your bold creative centerpiece, the idea you will stake this entire fortune on, is a talking sock puppet. It is charming. It is instantly memorable. Within weeks it becomes wildly, nationally famous, and it sells almost nothing whatsoever. The reasoning first surfaces, predictably, during a beanbag meeting, wrapped comfortably in the usual fog. To win, the logic goes, you must first be known. To be known, you must be everywhere at once. And the single most everywhere place in the entire country, the one screen the whole nation happens to be starring at on the very same night, is the biggest game of the year. So you buy a slot, 30 seconds of the single most valuable airtime in existence, a stretch of screen so expensive it makes even your most hardened bankers visibly wince. You sign off on it without hesitation, because hesitating, you have long since decided, is for companies with a burn rate they actually respect. Then comes the creative concept itself, and here your marketing team presents their triumphant idea, not a demonstration of the actual product, not an explanation of precisely what the company does, which would admittedly prove difficult given that no one working here seems entirely sure. Instead, a mascot, a sock puppet, floppy, wide-eyed, and inexplicably charming, who will speak directly to the entire nation and in 30 short seconds win its heart completely. You look at the puppet. The puppet, in its own flat felt way, looks back at you. And against every instinct a genuinely serious businessperson should have, you fall completely in love with it on the spot and approve the concept without a second's hesitation. The advertisement airs, and for 30 glorious seconds that small sock puppet dances across tens of millions of television screens, cracking jokes, radiating an odd charm, becoming, almost overnight, an authentic star. The entire nation is charmed. The puppet becomes an instant sensation. People quote its lines at the office the next morning. People want the puppet on merchandise, on late-night television, at public appearances. Your mascot achieves, within days, a level of genuine fame you have personally never come close to, beloved from one coast to the other. A full-blown cultural phenomenon, born from a felt sock and an almost obscene pile of your investors' money. There is only one small, easily overlooked problem, a detail that hardly seems worth mentioning at the celebratory lunch afterward. The puppet, for all its fame, does not actually make anyone buy anything. People adore the mascot. People remember it fondly, recite its catchphrase at parties. And then those same people go about their day without ever once visiting your website, without ever making a single purchase, without doing the one specific thing this staggeringly expensive commercial was actually designed to accomplish. You have purchased fame, pure and dazzling, almost entirely divorced from any actual sales. A nation full of enthusiastic fans and almost no paying customers to show for it. But you cannot feel the underlying problem yet, not in this particular warm season of glory. Fame, in the moment, feels indistinguishable from success. Recognition feels, quite convincingly, like winning. When strangers on the street light up at the mere mention of your mascot, when the puppet appears on talk shows and magazine covers of its own, It becomes intoxicatingly easy to mistake being known for being profitable, to believe that all this attention must surely, somehow, be quietly converting into revenue in ways too complicated to easily trace. It is not, but the confusion, for now, is genuinely delicious, and you swim in it happily without a second thought. The puppet, in the end, will go on to outlive the company itself, remembered fondly long after the actual business has faded quietly into a cautionary footnote in someone else's history lesson. But that particular joke has not been written yet. For now, you have a beloved, famous mascot, and a brand built entirely around the unshakable belief sitting at the center of your whole empire. The belief that absolutely anything, without exception, can and should eventually be sold through a screen. Chapter 19. Everything sold through a screen. The core belief propping up your entire empire is, in its own way, beautifully simple and dangerously so. Anything can be sold online, and therefore, logically, everything eventually should be. Pet food, furniture, groceries delivered by a fleet of vans you do not, strictly speaking, actually own yet. It does not particularly matter that shipping a modest bag of dog food across the entire country costs more than the bag of dog food itself. It does not matter that the real numbers, once someone finally sits down and writes them out honestly, read less like a business plan and more like a quiet cry for help. What matters in this decade is the vision, the glorious, inevitable future day when people buy their toothpaste from a glowing screen instead of a store shelf. You are years too early and burning cash every single step of the way. But you remain absolutely certain, without a shred of visible doubt, that the rest of the world will catch up to you any minute now. Faith itself is total, and it is in every meaningful sense a genuine faith complete with profits, converts, and a promised land waiting somewhere just over the horizon. You believe in your very bones that the old way of buying things, the store, the shelf, the drive across town, the shopping cart, is a doomed and clumsy relic of a bygone era, and that very soon every single category of human purchase will migrate onto the screen. Every product, every need a person could possibly have. Ordered from a chair, delivered straight to a front door, purchased entirely through the glorious, screeching magic of a dial-up connection, and you intend, with total confidence, to be the one who sells it all to them. So you sell everything. You launch new product categories with the reckless enthusiasm of a man who has never once actually looked at a shipping invoice. You will sell pet food, heavy, cheap, and wildly unprofitable to mail across an entire continent. You will sell furniture, enormous, fragile, and an absolute logistical nightmare to package and truck at a cost that dwarfs the price printed on the tag. You will sell groceries, promising fresh food delivered quickly, a promise that quietly requires warehouses, refrigeration systems, and an entire fleet of delivery vans you have already confidently described in detail to investors, despite not technically owning a single one of them yet. The real numbers, whenever anyone finally dares to write them down honestly, amount to a genuine horror story dressed up convincingly as a growth strategy. You sell a bag of dog food for less than it cost you to originally purchase it, then pay more than the entire sale price to ship it across the country, and then celebrate the whole transaction proudly as growth. Every single order quietly loses money. Every new customer represents a fresh small wound in the company's ledger. And the more you sell, the faster you lose money, accelerating steadily. A machine expertly engineered to turn $1 into roughly 80 cents at truly impressive scale. All of it cheered enthusiastically from the sidelines as unstoppable momentum. But you do not actually look at the numbers, and neither, notably, does anyone whose opinion you happen to value, because looking too closely at the real numbers would instantly break the entire beautiful spell. Instead, you look at the graph, the users, the orders, the great climbing lines of general activity, and you tell everyone entirely truthfully that people are indeed buying things through a screen in steadily growing numbers, that the underlying behavior is genuinely real, that the future is, in fact, arriving. You simply leave out the smaller detail that every single sale is quietly bleeding the company dry, because that, you have decided, is merely a footnote, a temporary inconvenience that will vanish the instant the company finally becomes large enough, which it always will. And here is the strange, almost tragic thing sitting underneath the whole spectacle. The underlying vision is genuinely correct. You are not wrong about the future at all. People will, one day, buy their pet food and their furniture and their groceries and their toothpaste from a glowing screen, in quantities that would make even you feel slightly dizzy. You have seen it clearly, this entire glittering world still waiting to arrive. You have simply arrived roughly a decade too early, moving at the wrong speed, down a phone line that dies the moment somebody down the hall orders lunch. Burning money steadily to prove a point the wider world is simply not yet ready to reward. Still, being right, even far too early, feels genuinely wonderful, and being early feels, most days, like being a bold pioneer rather than a future cautionary tale. The press, at least for now, seems to agree completely, because while your internal ledgers quietly weep in the dark, the magazines have already decided that you are not, in fact, a reckless spender at all. They have decided that you are a genius, and they are about to put your face on the cover to prove it. Chapter 20, The Cover Story. Fame arrives, and it arrives in glossy form. The magazines come calling first, and then they simply will not stop. They want your face on their cover, arms folded, chin lifted slightly, gazing boldly into a future that only you, apparently, can currently see. Beneath a headline calling you a visionary, a wonder, the person who will change absolutely everything, you sit for interviews and share your personal philosophy on innovation, on failure, on the importance of thinking differently from everyone else in the room, and reporters write it all down carefully, as though you had personally just discovered fire for the first time. You begin, quietly at first, and then quite thoroughly, to believe it yourself. After all, if the most respected magazines in the entire country insist that you are a genius, who exactly are you to argue the point? The cover itself now hangs framed on your office wall, and you find yourself looking at it far more often than you would ever comfortably admit out loud. The photo shoot alone should probably have warned you. An actual celebrity photographer arrives, someone normally hired for musicians and movie stars, and spends the better part of an hour arranging the lighting specifically to make you look less like an exhausted man in a fleece vest, and considerably more like a prophet who has personally glimpsed the far side of history. They instruct you to cross your arms. They tell you to gaze off thoughtfully into the middle distance, unbothered, as though studying something profound that the rest of us simply cannot perceive. You hold the pose for what feels like an uncomfortably long time, feeling faintly ridiculous the entire way through. And then the finished magazine arrives on newsstands, and you look undeniably magnificent, and the ridiculousness of the whole exercise evaporates instantly, replaced by a warm, faintly dangerous glow that lingers for days. The headline itself turns out to be the truly intoxicating part of the whole exercise. They do not describe you as a young man who spends his investors' money on talking sock puppets. They call you a visionary. They call you the future of business itself, the mind quietly reshaping how the entire world is about to live, the genius standing at the very center of an ongoing revolution. They print your vaguest, most improvised opinions as though they had been carved carefully onto stone tablets. Your beanbag-born buzzwords, synergy, disruption, paradigm, appear in careful, serious print, elevated instantly from casual fog into something resembling genuine philosophy, simply because a respected national publication decided the words were worth writing down at all. The interview requests multiply from there, and slowly, you grow genuinely fluent in the particular language of the celebrated young founder. You speak, with total sincerity, about failure as though it were some beloved personal teacher, rather than a thing you have mostly managed to avoid so far by spending other people's money instead of your own. You speak about thinking differently, about cheerfully ignoring the doubters, about how the very greatest ideas always sound slightly insane at first. A line that conveniently reframes every single warning sign along the way as further, undeniable proof of your own brilliance. Reporters nod along. Reporters transcribe carefully. Reporters go home afterward and write pieces that make you sound like some improbable cross between a brilliant inventor and a modern-day saint. And slowly, cover by cover, article by article, you genuinely begin to believe every word of it. This, quietly, is the true trap hiding inside the whole arrangement, the one no amount of money can ever fully protect you from. Somewhere deep down, you still know that the company loses money on every single bag of dog food it ships. You know the business plan is missing. You know the fortune is made almost entirely of paper, and that the puppet, for all its fame, sells almost nothing at all. But the magazines sound so confident, so glossy, so thoroughly authoritative, and every single one of them keeps insisting the exact same magnificent thing about you specifically. And it is, quite simply, easier and far more pleasant to believe the flattering strangers than to keep listening to that small, nagging voice inside your own head. So you choose to believe them instead. You have the cover professionally framed. You hang it on your office wall, positioned exactly where you can see it clearly from your favorite beanbag. You tell visitors casually that it was no particular big deal, a nice bit of press, nothing more, while privately glancing at it a dozen times most days. There you are, arms crossed, gazing thoughtfully into the future, anointed publicly as a genius by people who never once thought to ask precisely how the underlying business actually makes money. It is, without question, the single most flattering mirror ever constructed, and you find increasingly that you simply cannot stop staring into it. Chapter 21. A beach you cannot actually enjoy. The trouble with being crowned a genius by the national press is that you slowly begin acting like one, spending, expanding, believing with a confidence that has, by now, lost nearly all of its original breaks. And naturally, a certified genius cannot reasonably be expected to travel with ordinary people. A genius, you have decided, needs to rise above all of that, quite literally, which is precisely how you come to find yourself standing on a private runway one afternoon, keys in hand, about to make one of the most gloriously unnecessary purchases of your entire life. Every so often, a man in your position must relax, and when that man happens to be you, relaxing generally means chartering a private jet to somewhere warm, for reasons that begin, technically, as business and quietly curdle, somewhere over the ocean, into complete nonsense. You bring your laptop along, as always. You do not open it once. You lie on a beach that costs more per single night than a small, modest house, sipping something expensive and vaguely tropical, calling the whole trip a working retreat while working, in practice, precisely none at all. Your phone still buzzes steadily in your pocket. The stock price still haunts the edges of your attention. You have technically escaped to paradise, and yet somehow managed to bring all your usual anxiety along in the carry-on. The jet itself is the purest possible expression of your new station in life, and it seduces you almost the moment you first step aboard. No lines, no crowds, no sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers eating sandwiches at a crowded departure gate. You simply drive directly onto the runway, climb a short set of private stairs, and sink into a wide leather seat comfortable enough to sleep in properly. While a smiling attendant offers you a drink before the cabin door has even fully closed. It is travel with every last bit of ordinary friction sanded smoothly away, and once you have genuinely felt it, ordinary commercial flight becomes, quite suddenly, entirely unthinkable. A small daily humiliation you will now pay nearly any price to permanently avoid. You tell yourself as the plane climbs that this particular trip is technically work, and you half believe it as you say it. There is a conference somewhere nearby perhaps, or a meeting you could, in theory, technically take from a beach chair, and that thin, convenient justification is more than enough to file the entire lavish trip neatly under company expenses. You pack the laptop with genuinely good intentions. You will review the quarterly numbers. You will answer the backlog of emails. You will return from this trip refreshed, and somehow, impossibly, even more productive than before. A visionary working comfortably from paradise. The laptop, in the end, stays closed the entire trip. It becomes, quite literally, an extremely expensive paperweight with a mild sunburn of its own. Paradise itself, when you finally arrive, is genuinely staggering. A resort so exclusive that its own name functions mostly as a rumor among people who could never afford to stay there, where the sand appears freshly combed each morning, and the water sits the color of a polished jewel, and the staff seem to learn your personal preferences before you have even voiced them aloud. You lie on a lounger beneath a sky so relentlessly blue it almost looks artificially rendered, a cold drink sweating gently in your hand, the ocean whispering exactly the calming sounds the meditation recordings back home always promised, but never quite delivered. By every visible external measure, you have finally arrived at the very summit of human comfort, the exact destination all of this money was originally supposed to deliver you to. And yet you cannot actually relax, not really, not for more than a few uninterrupted minutes at a stretch, because you brought the anxiety along with you, tucked quietly into your carry-on right beside the sunscreen. The phone keeps buzzing. The pager still pulses faintly against your hip. And worst of all, you can still, right here on this supposedly perfect beach, check the stock price whenever the urge strikes. And so, of course, you do exactly that. You lie in paradise, refreshing a small glowing number, your stomach lurching gently with every minor dip. The same green line somehow reaching all the way across an entire ocean to keep its firm grip on your mood. The small, self-inflicted tragedy sitting at the center of it all is that you have purchased the single finest escape money can currently buy, and then quietly refuse to actually take it. You are, physically, standing in something close to heaven. You remain mentally still hunched over your desk back home, watching the wound, running the same anxious mental arithmetic. The sunset, when it finally arrives, is genuinely spectacular, painting the entire sky in colors that should, by any reasonable measure, stop even the most distracted heart cold. And for one clean, unguarded moment, you look up from the screen and simply see it, and it is beautiful, and you feel, briefly, something close to actual peace. Then the phone buzzes again, and the moment quietly closes, and you are back inside the machine once more. You fly home eventually, rested somewhat in body and considerably more frayed in spirit, and you decide, the way men exactly like you always seem to decide, that the real problem was never the anxiety itself. It was, surely, simply the wrong destination. What you clearly need, you tell yourself on the flight home, is more places to escape to. Which is precisely how you begin, almost immediately, buying homes you will very likely never actually sleep in. Chapter 22. A collection of empty rooms. One mansion, it turns out, is simply not nearly enough, though nobody around you can quite explain exactly why, so naturally you go and buy another. A place in the mountains, for the skiing you never actually do. A place directly on the ocean, for the relaxing you cannot seem to manage anywhere. A smaller apartment in the city, reserved for the nights you are simply too tired to drive all the way home to any of your other, larger homes. Most of these properties sit empty for months at a stretch, dusted quietly and faithfully by staff members you have genuinely never met in person, waiting patiently for visits that arrive only rarely, if at all. You now own considerably more bedrooms than you could possibly sleep in across an entire calendar year, collecting houses the way a child collects marbles, not to actually use them, but simply to possess them, and to know, somewhere in the back of your mind, that you can. It begins, as these things generally do, with a perfectly reasonable-sounding idea. You have grown tired of hotels, even the genuinely excellent ones, and it occurs to you one afternoon that a man of your current means should simply own a place in the mountains, somewhere private to retreat to whenever the pressure back home builds too high. So you buy one, A sprawling timber lodge with floor-to-ceiling windows framing a spectacular view of the surrounding peaks. And you spend, across the entire first year of ownership, a total of 2 nights there, both of which you spend entirely indoors on the phone, ignoring the mountains completely. But an appetite once properly fed does not shrink easily. The ocean calls next, and reason, as usual, follows obediently a step behind. You need somewhere by the sea, naturally, somewhere to truly and finally unwind. And so you acquire a striking glass and concrete property perched dramatically above the waves, complete with an infinity pool that appears to spill directly toward the horizon, and a wine cellar you will, in all likelihood, never once open. It is genuinely breathtaking. It is enormous, and for roughly 360 days of any given year, it sits completely empty, maintained flawlessly by a full staff on behalf of an owner who almost never visits. Then comes the city apartment, justified by the simplest and most quietly absurd logic of the entire collection. Sometimes, after a particularly late night out in town, you are simply too exhausted to make the 20-minute drive back to your main residence. And so, naturally, you purchase an entire penthouse, reserved specifically for those particular nights. A home whose sole purpose is to save you a short drive back to a different home you already own. You have now, at considerable expense, solved a problem that never genuinely existed in the first place, and you feel, for a brief and satisfying moment, remarkably clever for having done so. The homes continue to accumulate, and alongside them, an invisible small army of staff you employ, but almost never actually see. Housekeepers dust rooms you have not personally entered in months. Gardeners tend to grounds you have never once walked across. Caretakers keep the heating running and the pipes clear inside houses that stand dark and silent, night after night, waiting. You have become, in effect, the ghost these particular homes are quietly haunted by. An owner glimpsed once or twice a season, a signature appearing regularly on the payroll. A man whose beds are freshly made each day for a body that is almost always, somehow, somewhere else entirely. If you ever added them all up, and you genuinely never do, you would find that you personally own more bedrooms than there are nights remaining in the year for you to possibly use them. A portfolio of empty rooms scattered generously across mountains, coastlines, and city skylines. You do not visit most of them regularly, mostly because you cannot properly rest there any better than anywhere else, and you cannot rest properly anywhere because the same low anxiety follows you everywhere you happen to go. And so each new house solves precisely nothing, and simply becomes one more beautiful place where you continue failing to relax. But you keep buying anyway, because the buying itself has quietly become the entire point. Each purchase was never really about the house at all. It is about the feeling that comes with it, the proof, the quiet reassurance that you have genuinely arrived, that a young man who once shared a cramped apartment with roommates now owns coastlines and mountaintops of his own. The houses function as trophies, not homes, and you collect them the way you now collect nearly everything, hungrily, restlessly, chasing a satisfaction that seems to keep moving one purchase further out of reach. And when even the houses themselves are not quite enough, you fill them, floor to ceiling, with gadgets. Chapter 23. A house that refuses to obey. Naturally, being a person of the future, and now a magazine-certified visionary besides, you fill your primary home with technology decades ahead of its time, and roughly half as functional as advertised. Lights that dim obediently by voice command, provided you say the exact phrase perfectly, twice in a row, while standing very still. A refrigerator connected directly to the internet, for reasons nobody has ever successfully explained to your satisfaction. A home theater equipped with more individual remote controls than a small spacecraft, so genuinely complicated that watching a single film requires both a printed instruction sheet and, on bad nights, something close to an actual prayer. When the system works properly, it feels, briefly, like pure magic. When it fails, which happens often, you find yourself standing in your own multi-million-dollar house, unable to switch on a single lamp, quietly wondering whether the future is entirely on your side after all. You could not resist installing it, of course. You are, after all, a man of the future, a certified visionary according to at least 3 separate magazine covers, and it would be more than a little embarrassing to live in a house that still switches its lights on the way an ordinary person does, with a single finger and a wall switch. So you had the entire property wired at tremendous expense by a team of earnest young engineers who promised you a home that would think, anticipate your needs, and obey your every spoken word. A house straight out of tomorrow, they promised, one that would make dinner guests gasp audibly upon arrival. You signed the enormous invoice with the confident flourish of a man buying his own way directly into the next century. The lights themselves prove to be the first quiet betrayal. They respond to your voice, in theory, dimming or brightening on command, which sounds genuinely miraculous right up until you actually attempt it for the first time. You must say the exact phrase, in precisely the right tone, at precisely the right volume, ideally while standing in precisely the right spot in the room without moving. And even then, the system pauses for a long, thoughtful moment before either obeying, or, with equal likelihood, plunging an entirely different room into sudden darkness instead. You have stood in your own living room more than once, repeating the same command to your own ceiling, quietly negotiating with your house as though it were holding you hostage, while a simple, reliable switch waited patiently on the wall directly behind you. The refrigerator connects faithfully to the internet, a sentence that impressed absolutely everyone at your last dinner party and has never, not once, actually improved a single meal. Nobody, including the engineers who originally designed it, can fully explain what a connected refrigerator is actually meant to accomplish. And yours, in practice, mostly does exactly what every ordinary refrigerator does, plus occasionally displaying a cryptic error message about an available software update. It is, in the end, a very cold, very expensive box, faithfully keeping your beige diet shakes chilled while quietly announcing to absolutely no one that it happens to be online. The home theater remains the true masterpiece of this whole overreaching enterprise, a plush, darkened room built expressly for cinematic bliss, and rendered, through its own excessive sophistication, nearly impossible to actually use. There exists a small pile of separate remote controls, each governing a different individual component, and to watch even a single film, you must operate all of them in precisely the correct sequence, rather like diffusing something dangerous. There is, without exaggeration, a laminated instruction sheet sitting on the side table, prepared carefully by your household staff, explaining, step by step, exactly how to make the room simply display a movie. Guests routinely assume this must be some kind of joke. It is not a joke. So there you find yourself, on a perfectly quiet evening, entirely alone in one of your several enormous, immaculate, empty homes, wanting nothing more complicated than to dim the lights and watch something forgettable on television, and finding yourself thoroughly defeated by your own future. The lights ignore your commands. The theater demands its full laminated ritual. The refrigerator hums along smugly, connected faithfully to a world that does not particularly care. You stand there in the dark of a house that cost an absolute fortune and currently cannot, at this specific moment, produce a single working light, and the irony lands with a soft, cruel weight you feel all the way down. Still, on its genuinely good days, when the technology actually works as promised, it does feel remarkably like magic, a small, convincing glimpse of a smoother, softer world still quietly on its way. But the good days remain rare, and the frequent bad days leave you fumbling in your own dark palace for an ordinary light switch, the great visionary, comprehensively undone by a single stubborn lamp. Chapter 24. Handing money to other people's bad ideas. With money now pouring in faster than you can meaningfully spend it, you begin investing enthusiastically in other people's dreams as well, and your personal judgment, let us be gentle about it, takes an extended holiday of its own. You put real money into a company promising to deliver ice cream by mail. You back a small gadget that solves a problem no living person has ever actually reported having. Someone shows you a business plan so transparently doomed that a curious child could spot the obvious flaw within minutes, and you write the check anyway, because passing on what might be the next enormous idea has become the one fear that genuinely keeps you awake at night. Some of these bets turn out merely bad. A handful turn out to be historically, spectacularly disastrous. But each one, in the moment you sign the check, feels unmistakably like the smart play. And being seen as smart, you have come to realize, is the one thing you remain truly and completely addicted to. It happens gradually, almost without you noticing at first. Once you become widely known as a man with both money and vision, the dreamers begin arriving, an endless, eager procession of young founders, each carrying a graph of their own, each one utterly convinced they hold the next great idea, each one hoping quietly that you will bless their fledgling venture with a slice of your considerable fortune. And you, flattered, restless, and still flush with paper millions of your own, begin to say yes, again and again. You become, almost without meaning to, an investor, a backer, a wise elder of the boom, distributing money to the young the same generous way it was once distributed to you, on nothing more than the strength of a good story and an even better feeling in the room. The trouble is that your judgment, never especially rigorous even at its best, has now been thoroughly compromised by your own runaway success. You built an entirely unprofitable company into a genuine paper fortune on little more than pure belief, and so belief has quietly become the only investment tool you actually trust. When a young founder tells you with total conviction that people will happily buy ice cream through the mail, that it will arrive frozen and perfect and permanently change dessert as a category, you do not think to ask about the melting, or the shipping cost, or the obvious, fatal flaw sitting right at the center of the entire idea. You simply nod. You recognize the familiar energy. You write the check, because that particular energy, in your own personal experience, has a way of eventually becoming real money. So the ice cream company receives your investment and predictably melts into a warm, sweet disaster on doorsteps across the country. The strange gadget company receives your money too, and produces a device that solves a problem no living person has ever genuinely had, selling almost none of them. A steady parade of doomed ventures receives your backing, each one obvious in hindsight, each one flawed in a way that a calmer, poorer, considerably less flattered man would have spotted immediately. But you are none of those things anymore, and so the checks keep flowing steadily outward. What drives you is not simple greed, exactly, but a very specific and thoroughly modern fear, the fear of missing out entirely. Every ridiculous new idea might just conceivably turn out to be the next enormous thing, and the one single bet you happen to decline could easily be the one that makes some rival investor a legend instead of you. You have watched it happen before more than once. You have personally seen fortunes bloom from ideas that sounded genuinely insane at the time, including, somewhat uncomfortably, your very own. So you find that you simply cannot say no, because saying no feels indistinguishable from cowardice, from blindness, from becoming the fool who quietly passed on the future. And that particular role, above almost any other, is the one you cannot bear to play. And so you say yes, again and again, to the merely bad ideas and the spectacularly doomed ones alike, spreading your paper fortune thinly across an entire field of dreams, most of which will quietly wither within the year. You call it a portfolio. You call it vision. You tell yourself that a few significant winners will eventually cover the many inevitable losses, which happens to be the exact same reasoning currently keeping your own leaking company afloat. And you find the symmetry oddly reassuring rather than genuinely alarming. The bets that fail, and most of them do fail, sting considerably less than you might expect, partly because the money never quite felt entirely real to begin with, and partly because there is always another eager founder waiting at your door with another compelling story. But there remains one particular rivalry that stings in a way no amount of money seems able to soothe, and simply thinking about him is enough to quietly ruin an otherwise perfectly good afternoon. Chapter 25. A rivalry built on nothing. Every hero requires a nemesis, and yours happens to be another founder roughly your age, roughly your wealth, and in your private estimation roughly twice as insufferable. He runs a competing company built around a strikingly similar idea, and he has, if you're honest, an equally punishable haircut. You track his every public move. You bristle every single time when the magazines refer to him as the visionary. That word, specifically, feels like it belongs to you. You compete over office square footage, over party guest lists, over whose stock price climbed higher this particular quarter, over absolutely everything except actual profit, which, notably, neither of you has ever managed to produce. It is a rivalry built almost entirely on ego, fueled by money that is not entirely real, fought between two grown men who dress, on any given day, like they are heading out on a camping trip, and you would sooner burn through an entire fortune than allow him to win. You cannot quite remember exactly when it started, only that he has been there, somewhere at the edge of your own success, for as long as you have been successful yourself. His company does more or less what yours does, launched around roughly the same time, chasing the same customers, telling a remarkably similar story to a remarkably similar pool of investors. In another life, perhaps, the two of you might have become genuine friends. Two young men who happen to catch the same improbable wave at the same improbable moment. In this life, he functions as your mirror and your torment simultaneously, living proof that you are not, in fact, singular, and you resent him with a passion you reserve for absolutely no one else. You track him obsessively, more than you would ever willingly admit out loud. You read every single article written about him, especially the flattering ones, which have an uncanny way of ruining your entire afternoon. You know his current stock price nearly as well as your own, and you check it almost as frequently, quietly cheering its dips with a bitterness that would embarrass you deeply if you ever spoke it aloud to another person. You know precisely who attended his last party, and whether it was larger than yours, and whether his band was somehow more famous than the one you hired. You hold detailed opinions about his office layout, his haircut, his personal catchphrases, and his fleece vest, which, in your considered view, is somehow worse than your own fleece vest, in ways you could elaborate on at considerable and unnecessary length. The competition itself plays out across the most gloriously pointless arenas imaginable. You lease an entire additional floor of office space, because you happen to hear that he leased a floor first. You throw a more expensive party because his last one received better press coverage. You chase the exact same magazine covers, and when the writers eventually call him the visionary of the industry, your word, your entire carefully built identity, you feel it land like an actual theft, a genuine wound, an outrage that keeps you awake at night silently composing rebuttals nobody will ever actually read. The two of you are, in effect, racing each other toward the edge of the same cliff, and the only thing that seems to matter on any given day is arriving there first. And here sits the joke quietly waiting at the very center of the entire rivalry, plainly visible to everyone except the two of you directly involved. Neither company makes a single dollar of profit. You are locked in a furious, all-consuming battle for supremacy, fighting over a prize that does not, in any real sense, actually exist. Each of you is busy burning through a genuine fortune to prove you are the greater genius, while the actual scoreboard, the boring one, the one that simply measures whether a business earns more money than it spends, reads 0 to 0, month after month. You are fighting bitterly over the crown of a kingdom that is quietly, steadily running out of money beneath both of your feet. But you cannot see it that way yet. Not while the game itself is still technically running. Not while the magazines are still watching closely and the stock is still, for now, mostly climbing, and the parties keep getting bigger. In the fever of this particular boom, beating him has come to feel like the entire point of your existence, the true measure of your worth, more important on the worst days than your company's actual profit, more important than good sense itself, more important, if you're brutally honest, than the health of the business you supposedly built. Ego has quietly replaced arithmetic as the thing you're genuinely working to build here. And the rivalry, as it turns out, has cost you a great deal more than money alone. It has cost you sleep, focus, and peace, entire nights and weekends surrendered willingly to a competition that exists mostly, if you're honest with yourself, inside your own head. And that relentless, grinding drive to win at absolutely any cost is about to collect its overdue bill in the one currency you have been quietly overspending all along without noticing: yourself. Chapter 26. The Cot Behind the Desk. Beneath all the wealth and the toys, a quieter, considerably stranger truth has settled in. You are exhausted in a way that no amount of money seems capable of fixing. You wear the lack of sleep almost like a medal of honor. You brag in interviews about working 100-hour weeks, about surviving on caffeine and pure adrenaline, about a small cot tucked into the corner of your office where you collapse for a few hours before the sun, and inevitably the phone, drag you back up again. Rest, you have quietly decided, is for people without genuine vision. But your hands shake, just slightly, around the coffee mug most mornings now. Your thoughts blur faintly at the edges by early afternoon. You are richer than you ever dreamed of being as a younger man, and more tired than you have ever been in your entire life, running steadily on fumes toward a finish line that keeps politely, endlessly moving further away from you. It did not happen all at once. It crept in slowly, the same way the stock-checking habit originally crept in, one late night becoming a small habit, one skipped weekend gradually becoming an entire lifestyle. Somewhere along the way, without quite noticing the shift, you decided that sleep itself was a weakness, a small luxury reserved for lesser, less committed men, a slow leak in the tank of your own ambition, and you began treating it as an enemy to be actively defeated, rather than a basic need to be reasonably met. You are, in fact, quietly proud of this. You mention it in interviews the way a soldier might describe an old scar. The cot has become, in its own way, the centerpiece of this entire exhausting performance. You keep one tucked behind a screen in your office, and you sleep there in practice, more often now than you sleep in any of your several enormous, immaculate, largely empty homes. You collapse onto it in the small hours, still fully dressed, and you wake a few hours later, either when the phone buzzes insistently, or the sun leaks in through the blinds, or the low hum of anxiety simply refuses to let you rest any longer. It is, in its own strange way, a peculiar kind of wealth, a man who owns mansions across 3 separate coastlines, choosing instead to sleep on a narrow cot beside his own desk. But you call it dedication, and remarkably, everyone around you seems to agree without question. You run almost entirely on stimulants now, and you have long since stopped pretending otherwise. Coffee, endless cups of it, plus whatever else keeps the whole engine turning over reliably. The result is a jittery, wired, permanently accelerated version of yourself, one that has quietly begun mistaking agitation for genuine energy. Your hands have developed a faint tremor you first notice each morning as you lift your mug. Your thoughts move quickly but slip through your fingers before you can properly hold on to them, ideas left half-formed, sentences trailing off mid-thought. The comfortable fog of your beanbag speeches has begun creeping quietly into your actual private thinking as well. You are not, if you're honest, especially sharp anymore. You are merely fast, which is not remotely the same thing, though the two feel remarkably similar at 3 in the morning. The exhaustion carries a cost you cannot properly tally, mostly because a genuinely tired mind is always the very last thing to notice its own dulling. You make decisions worse than you once did, even though you feel, if anything, more decisive than ever. You miss small but important things. You snap, more often than before, at people you would once have effortlessly charmed. The relentless pace that was originally meant to build the company has begun quietly eroding the one single person the entire company cannot function without, and you are simply too depleted, most days, to notice, mistaking your own slow unraveling for the ordinary price of genuine greatness. And underneath all of it sits the cruelest detail of all: the finish line itself simply will not hold still. You tell yourself night after night that you are working this hard specifically to reach a point of genuine rest, some eventual summit where the constant struggle finally ends and you can exhale properly for the first time in years. But every time you draw close to it, the line slides further away, always just a little bigger than before. You keep telling yourself, just a little further. Just past the next funding round, the next strong quarter, the next small victory over your rival. And then, finally, you will rest. You never actually do. The goal itself functions as a horizon, and horizons, by their very nature, do not permit anyone to actually arrive. You are, by any honest measure, wealthier than the boy you once were could ever have reasonably imagined, and considerably more depleted than he ever was, even during his poorest, most frightened days. Money bought you the mansions, the private jets, the gleaming cars, and it could not in the end buy you a single genuinely good night's sleep. And it is in exactly this hollowed out, over-caffeinated state that you attempt something money makes uniquely, almost cruelly difficult, something that requires a rested, open heart you simply no longer have available to give. Chapter 27. Loved for the wrong reasons, possibly. Romance becomes genuinely complicated once you can no longer confidently tell whether someone is drawn to you specifically, or to your rapidly growing net worth instead. And the honestly uncomfortable truth is that, most of the time, neither can they. Suddenly, without quite understanding the mechanism behind it, you have become very charming, very interesting, and apparently, according to several new acquaintances, noticeably taller than you remember being 2 years earlier. You take dates now to restaurants where the menu carries no visible prices at all, which is, in its own quiet way, its own particular kind of warning sign. You talk, more often than you'd like to admit, about the company, mostly because somewhere along the way you seem to have genuinely forgotten how to talk comfortably about anything else. And late at night, alone in one of your several echoing, empty mansions, a small, stubbornly honest part of you quietly wonders whether the affection you're receiving is real, or simply another kind of investment, someone betting on you, the same way everyone else around you has been betting for months, hopping quietly for a healthy return. You did not used to be particularly charming. You remember this clearly because it was not in the grand scheme of things especially long ago. 2 years earlier, you were an awkward young man with an unusual idea and an empty wallet, and the world was, by and large, distinctly unimpressed with you. Now somehow, you are magnetic. You walk into a crowded room and heads genuinely turn. You tell a fairly mediocre joke and it lands reliably like genuine wit. You have, according to several recent acquaintances, become witty, fascinating, and even physically taller. A transformation no diet shake could plausibly explain, though a large enough fortune, apparently, manages it easily. The dates themselves carry a strange, weightless quality to them. You take people to restaurants exclusive enough that the menus arrive deliberately without prices printed anywhere, a small detail meant to signal, quietly, that cost itself is beneath discussion at this particular table. A detail you find, if you sit with it honestly, quietly ominous rather than luxurious, a room entirely full of dishes whose true value has been deliberately concealed from view. You order things you genuinely cannot pronounce correctly. You are treated, everywhere you now go, like something rare and precious, and you can never fully determine whether the warmth directed at you is meant for you personally, or for the reputation that now walks into every room a step or two ahead of you, like a herald announcing your arrival. You have also become, if it must be said honestly, fairly poor company these days, though nobody around you seems to have the heart to point this out directly. You have quietly forgotten how to discuss anything beyond the company itself. Across candlelit tables, over food that costs a genuine fortune, you hold forth at length about your platform, your grand vision, your ongoing rivalry, your stock price, while your date across the table nods politely, smiles, and slowly begins to realize that there is remarkably little remaining room in your life for another actual person, because the entire available space has already been claimed by the business. The doubt, when it surfaces, is genuinely the worst part of the whole arrangement, the small, corrosive question you cannot quite manage to silence. When someone laughs warmly at your jokes, admires your mind aloud, gazes at you appreciatively across a menu with no visible prices, a cold, quiet voice at the back of your head asks whether any of it is truly meant for you, or whether you have simply become, in practice, the single most promising investment currently sitting in the room. You genuinely cannot always tell the difference anymore. And the harder, more uncomfortable truth is that the people sitting across the table from you often cannot fully tell the difference either, their own feelings quietly tangled up in the general glow of your success, until affection and simple opportunity blur together into the same warm, indistinct light. So you retreat most nights, back to one of your enormous, silent houses, and the contrast between the two halves of your life could hardly be sharper. All that attention, all that warmth, all that admiration directed at you across a candlelit table, and then an hour later a set of entirely empty rooms, a made bed nobody has slept in, and a silence so total that you can clearly hear your absurdly expensive refrigerator humming quietly to itself somewhere downstairs. You have never, in your entire life, been more surrounded by people who claim to want to be near you. You have also never, if you're being fully honest, felt more genuinely alone. And you are simply too tired and too guarded these days to properly work out whether that particular imbalance is the world's fault or quietly, privately, your own. You tell yourself, as you drift toward sleep most nights, that none of this matters just yet. That real connection is a problem reserved for later, after the company finally wins, after you at last reach that finish line which keeps sliding politely out of reach. There will be time enough then for the real things. Security, you promise yourself quietly, comes first. But security, as you are about to discover in the sharpest possible terms, was never nearly as solid as it looked from the outside. Chapter 28. A question nobody wants to answer. Something in the air shifts, so subtly at first that you almost fail to notice it entirely. A reporter, during what should have been a routine interview, asks a question that carries no adoration in it at all, only quiet skepticism. The word profit hanging in the room afterward like a faint, unpleasant smell nobody wants to acknowledge directly. An investor who once gushed openly about your vision now taps his pen against the table and asks, quietly, almost gently, exactly when the money is finally expected to arrive. The stock wobbles briefly, then wobbles a second time, and this time it does not fully recover its footing. Other companies very much like yours, once golden, once celebrated on the very same magazine covers, begin whispering carefully about layoffs. You reassure everyone loudly, repeatedly, that this is nothing more than a temporary blip, a brief correction before the inevitable resumption of the climb. But that small, persistent voice in your head, the one that has been quietly asking what the company actually does since your very first morning commute, has started asking the question a great deal louder now, and considerably more often. The first real sign arrives, fittingly, in the form of a question, and it comes from a reporter, one of the very same species of journalist who spent the last 2 years anointing you a genius on glossy magazine covers. But this particular reporter does not lean forward with the usual admiration. She leans back instead, taps her pen slowly against her notepad, and asks, almost gently, when exactly your company expects to turn its first actual profit. The word lands in the room like something spoiled. For a long moment you have no polished answer ready at all, only the old, familiar fog, the platform, the vision, the growth. And for the first time, watching her face carefully, you can see quite clearly that the fog is no longer working the way it used to. Then the investors, one by one, begin changing their tune. The very same men who once practically begged to hand you money, who thank you sincerely for the privilege of setting their own cash alight beside yours, now schedule meetings with a noticeably different energy about them. They do not gush anymore. They ask hard, boring, arithmetical questions, the exact questions everyone in the room had quietly agreed, for years, not to ask out loud. When precisely does the burn stop? Where specifically does the profit come from? They tap their pens patiently and wait, this time, for an actual answer. And your beautiful ascending graph, the one deliberately drawn without any numbers on either axis, suddenly looks considerably less like vision and a great deal more like evasion, which, if you're honest with yourself, is essentially what it always was. The stock feels the shift before anyone dares say a word about it aloud. That familiar green line, your private obsession, your daily mood ring, your unspoken measure of your own worth as a human being, begins, for the first time, to genuinely wobble. It dips, and instead of springing back the way it always reliably has before, it simply hovers there uncertain, before dipping again a short while later. You refresh the page and refresh it again, and the old familiar magic simply refuses to return this time. The number that only ever used to climb has apparently learned, somewhere along the way, how to fall as well. And each small decline sends a genuine chill through you that no amount of confident self-talk seems able to fully warm back up. Around you, the entire glittering ecosystem you have lived inside for years begins, almost imperceptibly, to shift its weight. Companies very much like your own, the golden children of this whole extraordinary boom, begin quietly whispering words that would have been genuinely unthinkable just one season earlier. Layoffs, cutbacks, runway. Founders who were, only last year, purchasing private jets of their own, are now quietly, nervously counting exactly how many months of cash remain in their accounts. The parties have grown noticeably less frequent. The venture money itself, once flowing like a wide, generous river, has slowed to something closer to a trickle, as though the men who control it have suddenly, collectively remembered that they generally prefer to fund businesses that actually make money, rather than stories that merely sound convincingly like they eventually will. You respond the only way you have ever really known how to respond, loudly, confidently, reassuringly. In every room you enter, you insist that this is nothing at all, a minor blip, a brief and temporary correction before the inevitable resumption of the climb everyone has grown so accustomed to. You give the familiar speech about doubters, about how the very greatest ideas in history have always faced skepticism before eventually triumphing. The exact same speech that once thrilled the very magazines now beginning to ask harder questions. You say it to your employees. You say it to your investors. You say it to the reporters gathered outside. And most of all, quietly, alone at night, you say it to yourself, and you very nearly believe it, because believing it at this point is the only thing you genuinely still know how to do. But underneath the confident public performance, the little voice has grown steadily louder, the same one that has been quietly asking its question since that very first red light on your very first ordinary commute to work. What does the company actually do? How, precisely, does it make its money? It used to be a whisper you could comfortably ignore for weeks at a stretch. Now it is nearly a shout, and for the first time in this entire glittering story, you do not have a reassuring answer ready, not even quietly for yourself. You tell everyone confidently that the storm will pass soon enough. You are, as it happens, about to learn precisely how wrong you were. Chapter 29. The morning the green line turns permanently red. It arrives in the end not as a single dramatic collapse, but as something slower and considerably more disorienting. A long, uneven slide that never quite announces itself as the ending until it has already, quietly, become one. The stock dips again one Tuesday morning, and this time it does not recover by Wednesday, or by the following week, or by the one after that. The green line you have spent months compulsively refreshing has settled, almost permanently now, into a shade of red you have never had to sit with for this long before. The calls from investors change in tone once more, moving past the merely hard questions and into something colder. There is talk now of restructuring, a soft, careful word that everyone in the building has quietly learned to translate correctly. There is talk of a bridge round, another investment meant simply to keep the company alive long enough to find its footing. Except this time the room's full of tanned, confident men are considerably harder to fill, and the checks, when they come at all, arrive smaller and with far more conditions attached than before. You call an all-hands meeting on the open floor, the same floor where the foosball table still sits, a little quieter than it used to be. You stand, not in a beanbag this time, but on your feet in front of several hundred people who believed in you enough to accept stock options instead of higher salaries, and you tell them, as gently and as honestly as you know how, that the company will need to let some of them go. Not because they failed at anything, not because the work was ever less than excellent, but because the money that was supposed to arrive by now has simply not arrived, and the fire that has been burning steadily for years has finally, quietly, run out of fuel to feed it. The room is very still. Somewhere near the back, the wizard, whose function nobody was ever quite able to explain, sits with his hands folded in his lap, and you find, watching him, that you cannot meet his eyes. The receptionist who once did careful arithmetic at her kitchen table, calculating a fortune that might one day make her richer than her landlord, sits near the front, and you notice, for the first time in a long while, how young she actually looks. You do the numbers yourself, later that night, alone in your office, on the same cot you have slept on more often than any of your several beds. The stock options that once represented dreams for hundreds of people are now, on paper, worth a small fraction of what they once promised, in some cases, worth nothing at all. The fortune that felt, only months ago, like the most solid thing in your entire life, has revealed itself in the end to have been exactly what it always technically was. A number on a screen, a shared and fragile agreement among strangers to keep believing in something a little while longer, and nothing more solid underneath than that. Chapter 30. What is left when the number stops climbing. You still own the houses, for now, though several of them will quietly change hands within the year, sold at a fraction of what you originally paid, to buyers who will use them the way houses are ordinarily meant to be used. You still own the cars, though you will drive fewer of them, and eventually sell the ones you never learned to properly operate in the first place. The fleece vests remain in your closet, worn now less as a statement and more simply because they are comfortable, and because old habits, even foolish ones, have a way of quietly outlasting the circumstances that created them. The rival, it turns out, does not do meaningfully better than you. His company falls too, in roughly the same season, for roughly the same reasons, and you find, when you finally hear the news, that you feel considerably less triumphant about it than you once imagined you would. There is no real satisfaction left in watching someone else's version of your own mistake play out in a slightly different building across town. Mostly you feel tired, and mostly, for the first time in years, you feel something close to your own age. The magazines move on to a new cover, a new visionary, a new graph climbing hopefully up and to the right without any numbers attached to it. You are no longer the story. This, too, in its own strange way, comes as something close to relief. And yet, and this is the part worth sitting with quietly tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you were not wrong about everything. The vision itself, however clumsily you chased it, however recklessly you funded it with other people's money, was not a lie. People did eventually begin buying their groceries and their furniture and their pet food and nearly everything else through a screen. The screeching modem gave way, eventually, to something faster, and then faster still, until the whole strange, glowing prophecy you once pitched to rooms full of skeptical men in glass towers quietly, patiently came true, just not for you, and not on the timeline you promised, and not without a great deal of other people's money burning along the way to get there. You were early. You were foolish. You were, in your own strange, sandal-wearing, over-caffeinated way, almost entirely right about the world that was coming, and almost entirely wrong about how quickly it would arrive, and what it would actually cost to wait for it. Closing. So how was your day at the top of the world? You woke in a mansion you barely knew. You drank a glass of expensive dust for breakfast. You drove a car you could not fully operate to a building full of foosball tables and free cereal, and told a room of serious men that a screeching phone line was, somehow, the future of everything. You burned money you never earned. You threw parties for no reason at all. You hired a wizard. You bought houses you never slept in, and watched a talking sock puppet become more famous, for one bright season, than you ever managed to become yourself. You became a paper billionaire before lunch, and in the end, watched it all quietly turn back into the story it always secretly was. It was absurd and it was reckless, and it was also, in its own strange way, genuinely human because beneath all the sludge and the sandals and the fish tanks, there was something worth remembering kindly. The willingness to look at a slow gray image of a golden retriever, loading one thin line at a time, and to believe with your whole chest that it would someday change the world. The future those dreamers chased so clumsily did eventually arrive, built more carefully by others on the wreckage of their hope. And tonight, as you lie in bed, and the whole world hums quietly along at your fingertips, delivering effortlessly and instantly everything they once promised and could not quite manage to deliver, maybe spare a small, warm thought for the ridiculous, hopeful people in the fleece vests who believed in it all just a little too soon. They burned bright, they burned fast, and in their own clumsy, overconfident way, they lit part of the path anyway. So rest now, breathe slowly. The future they dreamed of is here. It arrived gently in the end, and tonight it is yours.